Chapter 320. Father. We need to find a place to hide from the rain. Hanses wiped the rainwater off his face and shouted anxiously. However, the tall and thin figure in front of him did not even turn around. Father. Why don't we find a higher place and tie the two horses together? We can hide under the horses' stomachs and leave after the rain stops. Sonny finally turned around to look at his son, who was in a sorry state, and roared in exasperation, "Shut up! As a knight of the Granta family, can't you take a little rain?" Hanses saw that his father was angry and immediately stopped shouting. However, he still looked indignant and muttered softly, "Not a knight apprentice." The two of them walked through the heavy rain for a while. Hanses suddenly shouted excitedly, "Fire, father! There's fire in front." Sonny looked at the direction Hanses was pointing at and frowned slightly. He said doubtfully, "We shouldn't have reached East Spring Town yet. Could it be a traveler passing by? No matter what it is, if there's fire, it means there's a place to hide from the rain. Let's go hide." Hanses squeezed the horse's stomach and sped up slightly. Sonny also temporarily put away his doubts and sped up. After walking for about 45 minutes, the two of them finally reached the top of a small hill. There was a large campsite here. Sonny looked at the obviously well-trained guards and tall war horses in the campsite and was shocked. He knew that this was definitely a noble's carriage, and a big one at that. The patrolling guards saw the two of them and immediately came forward to question them. "Honorable Knight, I am Sonny from the Granta family. This is my son, Hanses. We are passing by this place. May I borrow your campsite to hide from this damned storm?" "Granta? The Lord's family of Winterspring Town?" "Yes. Please wait for a moment." The knight returned to the campsite, probably to ask for instructions. Not long after, he returned and nodded at the two of them, "Come in. Thank you very much for your generosity." Sonny and his son led their horses into the campsite and were led into a large tent by the knight. There were already 7 to 8 guards gathered inside. "Give these two guests from the Granta family a blanket each. Let them warm up by the fire and drink some hot soup." The knight who led them in ordered. Hans hurriedly thanked him. With the help of the firelight in the tent, Sonny was able to clearly see the knight's armor and the golden lion insignia on his chest. Shocked, he blurted out, "Excuse me, is this the carriage of the Dukes of the North?" The knight nodded. "Yes, the Duke will also pass by Winterspring Town, so he can bring the two of you along." "Thank you so much." Sonny hurriedly expressed his gratitude, but a sense of doubt welled up in his heart. He knew that the Duke of St. Hilda had just been conferred a title by the Emperor, so the convoy should be returning to the northern frontier. But the problem was that the convoy wouldn't pass by Winterspring Town from Imperial Dragon City. Of course, Sonny wouldn't take the liberty to voice the doubts in his heart. He just smiled and said, "I wonder if I can have the honor to meet Her Grace and thank her personally." "It's too late today. I'll ask around for you tomorrow." "Okay, thank you very much." After watching the knight leave with large strides, Sean fell into deep thought as he drank the hot soup his son gave him. The next morning, the storm had stopped. The soldiers in the camp started a bonfire and started preparing breakfast. Steam rose from the 3 large pots as a few fat Mongolian gazelles rolled around on the barbecue rack. Golden grease dripped into the bonfire and exploded into sparks. The alluring aroma made Granto and his son swallow their saliva uncontrollably. After the meat was cooked, the servants untied the gazelles from the grill and skillfully used a small knife to cut the tender meat into 2 exquisite silver plates. 2 young and beautiful maids carried the silver plates and walked towards the most luxurious tent in the middle of the camp. Hans stared at the maids' perky buttocks, while Sonny stared at the tent in the middle of the camp. After breakfast, Sonny and Hans changed into clean clothes. After making sure that they didn't neglect anything, they patiently waited for the Duke to summon them. Not long after, the knight who led them into the camp last night came over and led them to the tent in the middle of the camp. Under Hans' curious and eager gaze, the two maids opened the tent's curtain and a delicate leather boot stepped out first. Then, a graceful figure came into Hans' sight. When the snow-white hand touched the curtain, Hans finally saw the face of the owner of the hand. Then, the 16-year-old boy was stunned. Her golden hair was coiled into an elegant upper-class bun, and her blue eyes were even deeper than sapphires. Her delicate nose was like jade, and her lips were as red as fire. There was a faint smile on her fair face, and as her eyes moved, Hans' mind became blank. He had long heard that the Dukes of the North was a stunning beauty. However, even though he had imagined her face countless times, it could not be compared to seeing her in person. Hans stared blankly at Vera as she walked out of the tent. He just wanted to crawl in front of her, kiss her feet, and praise her with the most beautiful poems. Unfortunately, this beauty did not even notice the silly boy from the Granta family. Instead, her left hand was holding the hand of another handsome boy behind her. Hans' heart was immediately consumed by jealousy. Of course, he knew that this handsome young man should be the husband of the Dukes of the North, Viscount Angli. However, Hans could not help but wonder why this goddess-like person was not holding his hand. Sonny looked at his son who was standing still and staring blankly at him. He knew that his son's old habit was acting up again. Therefore, he quickly stepped forward and blocked his son's rude gaze. He then bowed and greeted, "Honorable Duke of St. Hilda, Honorable Viscount Angli, thank you for lending a helping hand last night. Your kindness is as dazzling as the sun." Colin looked at the two people in front of him with great interest, especially the middle-aged man who claimed to be a scholar, Sonny Grantu. In fact, the Granta family was not a prominent family. The title of the family was only a baron, and their fief was only a small town in the Flaming Flame territory, Winterspring Town. If not for the fact that the Prime Minister, Baron Heidegger, had secretly asked Colin to go to Winterspring Town and said that there would be unexpected gains there, Colin would not have deliberately taken a detour to come to such a small town. Along the way, Colin had been guessing what was in Winterspring Town that the Prime Minister of the Empire had to pay attention to. Now that he coincidentally met Scholar Sonny, Colin suddenly had an idea. Scholar, this was a title that only graduates of the White Tower Academy could have. It might not be as noble as the title of a noble, but in Colin's heart, it was actually more important. "Scholar Sonny, you don't have to be so polite. Actually, we are also on our way to Winterspring Town to visit Baron Grantu, and we hope that you can introduce us to him." Colin chuckled as he chatted with Scholar Sonny. From the corner of his eye, he saw two small figures running toward them quickly. "Good morning, Sister Vera." "Good morning, teacher." Prince Harrison and Princess Judy greeted Vera first before they looked at Sonny and his son curiously. It seemed that they felt that the guests in the campsite were somewhat familiar. To his surprise, Scholar Sonny actually took the initiative to greet the two little fellows. "Prince Harrison, Princess Judy." Colin raised his eyebrows in surprise. He did not expose Harrison and Judy's true identity, and he also believed that the guards in the campsite would not reveal such information to two strangers. Unless, this Scholar Sonny already knew Harrison and Judy. Prince Harrison nodded in return. His little face was full of doubt as he asked, "You are?" Scholar Sonny smiled slightly, and there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "Your Highness, I am Sonny Grantu. Perhaps you don't remember, but 5 years ago, I was the Minister of Agriculture of the Empire." Chapter 321. "Harrison, do you know why Scholar Sonny was dismissed back then?" Colin asked in the moving carriage. Prince Harrison fell into deep thought, but after a moment, he frowned and shook his head. "Sorry, teacher, I can't remember." Colin nodded and didn't make things difficult for him. After all, Harrison was only 8 years old 5 years ago, and definitely didn't understand these political storms. "I know. I know." Princess Judy shouted, looking eager as if she was afraid that others couldn't see it. "All right, go ahead," Colin said with a smile. Judy rolled her eyes and smiled slyly. "Teacher, if I tell you why Scholar Sunny was dismissed, will you tell me the story? Ever since Colin made the little girl cry with Daughter of the Sea, he thought that she wouldn't pester him anymore. Unexpectedly, Judy became more and more clingy to Colin, insisting that he continue to tell her the story. Colin could only nod. All right. Anyway, he still remembered many of Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tales, so it wouldn't be a problem for him to deal with a little girl. Judy was delighted when she heard that, and immediately said as if she was showing off, because when Scholar Sunny was the Minister of Agriculture, he tried to push for an agricultural reform, but this reform attracted the opposition of many nobles, and it wasn't implemented in the end. Scholar Sunny was also dismissed because of this. What kind of agricultural reform? Colin asked. Princess Judy was stumped, and her delicate little face frowned. After thinking for a long time, she still couldn't think of anything. She pouted. Anyway, it's just a reform. Of course, Colin didn't expect the little girl to be able to tell him the content of the reform. He just wanted to give it a try, and indeed, there were no miracles. However, he felt more and more that Prime Minister Baron Heidegger had asked him to come to Winterspring Town because of this former Minister of Agriculture, Scholar Sunny. Or to be more precise, it was because of the agricultural reform plan that had been rejected back then. Then, Colin had to first figure out what kind of agricultural reform plan Scholar Sunny had proposed back then, and why it was rejected. He even lost his position as Minister of Agriculture because of this. Thinking of this, Colin could not help but lift the curtain of the carriage. Not far away, Scholar Sunny was riding a horse and walking side by side with Scholar Dwayne, chatting happily. Colin discovered that the graduates of the White Tower Academy seemed to know each other. Moreover, they had a strong sense of identity with each other. This kind of recognition seemed to have surpassed the friendship of classmates and rose to another level. Just as Colin's imagination was running wild, Judy's clear voice pulled him back to reality. Teacher. You said you would tell me a story. Colin could only smile and nod. All right, all right, all right. I'll tell you a story about Snow White. Hearing that Colin was going to tell a story, Prince Harrison did not find an excuse to run out like last time. Perhaps it was because he had heard Judy's Daughter of the Sea, but he started to feel that his teacher's story was not that scary. Even Vera shifted her gaze away from the Book of Brilliance and looked up at Colin, waiting for him to start his story. A long, long time ago, the queen of a certain country gave birth to a girl in winter. Her skin was as white as snow. Outside the carriage, Scholar Dwayne looked at the weathered face of his senior beside him and his sideburns that had been eroded by the wind and frost. Suddenly, his expression became a little sad. Scholar Sunny, how have you been all these years? Not bad. Scholar Sunny smiled lightly. Farming, grazing, even if I have to live like this for the rest of my life, I have nothing to be unwilling about. Dwayne stared at Sunny for a while and suddenly shook his head. I don't believe it. Sunny laughed and did not explain. Instead, he changed the topic. I'm not like you. I'm in my prime and have the king's trust. I'm sure that I'll be able to fulfill my ambitions in the northern frontier. What about you? Dwayne stared into Sunny's eyes and asked, Are you willing to stay in such a small place for the rest of your life and let your knowledge be buried? Scholar Sunny did not speak. He looked like he was struggling. Scholar Dwayne spoke again. Do you know? The Duke took a detour to Winterspring Town because of the Prime Minister's suggestion. Prime Minister? Scholar Sunny's expression changed. His gaze became even more complicated. After a while, he said coldly, Back then, the Prime Minister was resolutely against my reform plan. No, the Prime Minister just felt that your plan was too radical. You need to remove some measures, or take it step by step. You need to use gentle and gradual methods to make the empire's nobles accept your reform. You don't understand. Scholar Sunny had a pained expression. My reform plan is an entire system. Either you accept it completely or reject it completely. Compromise will only create a freak that even I can't control. Scholar Dwayne was silent. After a while, he suggested, "Have you ever thought of going to the northern frontier?" Scholar Sunny hesitated. He knew very well that the Duke of St. Hilda and his wife did not come to Winterspring Town to visit his brother, Baron Grantu. A mere baron did not have that much charisma. Their target could only be him. "Does the Duke know of my reform plan?" Scholar Sunny felt a surge of hope. Scholar Dwayne shook his head and said, "No, the Duke does not know about it yet. However, you can tell your ideas to the guardian of the northern frontier, Viscount Angley." Scholar Sunny keenly noticed that Dwayne had suggested that he go to Colin instead of Vera. Obviously, the one who was in charge of this couple was the man who had a lower status. But are you sure that my reform plan will not be met with the same situation at the northern frontier?" Scholar Sunny was still hesitating. Scholar Dwayne said in a deep voice, "You should know the current situation at the northern frontier. The war has just ended, and famine is raging. Moreover, the Duke of St. Hilda and Viscount Angley have absolute power. Believe me, there is no better place than the northern frontier. If your reform plan cannot be implemented at the northern frontier, I advise you to give up as soon as possible." These words made Scholar Sunny's eyes gradually become firm. After a moment of silence, he gritted his teeth and nodded, "Okay. I have a manor in the south of Winterspring Town. I wonder if I can invite the Duke to rest there." Scholar Dwayne smiled and nodded. "I'll ask around for you." The prince ordered that the queen be forced to wear red-hot iron shoes. He made her dance continuously until she died so that the wedding could proceed smoothly. After Snow White and the prince got married, their lives were full of joy and happiness. They have been living together happily ever since. After Colin finished telling the story, he took the flower tea from Vera and drank it in one gulp. Princess Judy held her chin and her eyes sparkled. She looked forward to it and said, "Wow! I am so happy. When will my prince appear?" When Colin heard this, he was about to tease his female student when he heard Scholar Dwayne's voice coming from outside the carriage. "Duke, Viscounts, Scholar Sunny invites you to his manor for a rest." Colin's expression changed and he immediately replied, "Okay. Then I will disturb you." Chapter 322. Sunny's manor was located in the south of Winterspring Town. A large piece of land was surrounded by a simple wooden fence, but it was basically farmland and pastures. There were no luxurious buildings in the area. As soon as they entered the manor, Harrison and Judy asked to ride a horse. Therefore, Bachelor Sunny asked his son, Hans, to take them to the racecourse. On the other hand, Colin and Vera were led by Bachelor Sunny to a field. "Bachelor Sunny, are these farmers all planting sweet potatoes?" Colin asked in surprise. Even if he was not proficient in farming, Colin knew that the staple food of this world was barley and wheat. There was also some rice. Although people knew that sweet potatoes were also edible, it was not considered a mainstream food. "Yes, Sir Viscounts. The main crop that I plant in this farm is sweet potatoes," Bachelor Sunny explained patiently. "You may not know this, but sweet potatoes have many advantages. If you plant 100 pounds of sweet potatoes in 1 mu of land, you can harvest 600 pounds of sweet potatoes next year. The yield of sweet potatoes is 1 to 6, and the yield of barley is 1 to 2. In addition, sweet potatoes are grown underground, and their fruits are not pecked by birds. However, in general wheat fields, even if the farmer guards them tightly, 10 to 20% of the wheat will be ruined by birds every year. Therefore, these sweet potatoes do not need to be guarded. The farmer only needs to water and fertilize them regularly. The yield of sweet potatoes is so high," Vera said in surprise with her eyes wide open. Now that she had become the Dukes of the North, Vera naturally began to worry about the northern frontier. At present, the biggest crisis in the northern frontier was the food problem. Therefore, after hearing that the yield of sweet potatoes was so high, Vera immediately paid attention to it. Although she also knew that the taste of sweet potatoes was definitely not as good as bread, for the civilians in the famine, as long as they could fill their stomachs, they would not care about the taste at all. However, Colin was not that excited. Of course, he had heard that the yield of sweet potatoes was higher than that of wheat. However, even on Earth, sweet potatoes could not replace rice and wheat as the staple food. Therefore, there must be some problems. Bachelor Sunny, don't tell me that sweet potatoes have no shortcomings? Colin asked calmly. Of course. Senior Sunny nodded and frankly said, sweet potatoes are slightly poisonous and are not suitable for human consumption for a long period of time. They can easily cause diarrhea. Also, sweet potatoes are more destructive to the soil, so they need a lot of fertilizer. However, these shortcomings of the sweet potato were nothing compared to its high yield and labor-saving advantages. Especially with the current situation in the northern frontier, as long as we promote the planting of sweet potatoes, the famine will be controlled in the shortest time possible. Vera's pretty face was flushed with excitement. It seemed that she already felt that the promotion of sweet potatoes in the northern frontier was a very feasible measure. But when she saw Colin frowning, she gradually calmed down and realized that there might be a problem that she had not noticed. Seeing this, Scholar Sunny did not continue explaining. Instead, he said, Lord Duke, Lord Viscounts, I'll take you to a place. Vera and Colin then followed Bachelor Sang and I and continued to move forward. It did not take them long to arrive in front of a large shed. Before they even got close, Colin could already hear the sound of a wild boar coming from the shed. Please forgive me, my two distinguished guests. The smell is a little strong, Scholar Sunny reminded them carefully. Sure enough, an indescribable stench hit them and Vera and Colin almost fainted. Fortunately, they were not pampered people, so they endured the stench and came to the shed. Are you raising wild boars in captivity? Colin was even more surprised. The meat in this world was mainly cattle and sheep. Due to the stench of pork and the poor habits of pigs, their hygiene was completely incomparable to cattle and sheep. Therefore, only the commoners would eat pork. The nobles simply did not want to eat this kind of dirty animal. However, Colin, who came from China, had long been accustomed to eating pork. After crossing over to this world, he felt that it was a pity that he could no longer eat red braised pork and other delicacies in his previous world. Although Colin did not specifically learn about wild boars, he also knew that there were no domesticated wild boars in this world. After all, the nobles did not eat wild boars and ordinary civilians did not have any extra food to feed pigs. At most, when they wanted to eat meat, they would hunt some wild boars in the wild to improve their diet. But now, the former Minister of Agriculture of the Empire had actually begun to consciously raise wild boars in captivity. Colin could not help but think highly of him. Yes, Sir Viscounts. Scholar Sunny nodded. Wild boars are not as valuable as cattle and sheep, but they are very easy to feed and can eat almost anything. For example, the sweet potato leaves that you saw in the sweet potato field can be used to feed the wild boars. A wild boar could produce about 500 pounds of meat a year, and a sheep could produce about 100 pounds of mutton at most. As for cows, it would take 3 years to slaughter, but they could only produce about 1,000 pounds of meat. Do you think that it is cost-effective to raise wild boars? Before Colin could speak, Vera shook her head and said, however, the nobles will not eat such lowly animals. Are you planning to sell the wild boars to the civilians? Scholar Sunny, with all due respect, I am afraid that the civilians will not buy your wild boars either. After all, wild boars are everywhere. They would rather hunt for wild boars by themselves or buy them from hunters at a low price. Moreover, although cattle and sheep do not produce much meat, their skin, tendons, and wool are very valuable and have many uses. Not to mention that cattle and sheep also produce milk. As for wild boars, their only advantage seems to be that they produce a lot of meat. However, their meat is dry and smelly. Let alone the nobles, even the civilians are not willing to eat them for a long time. Who said that the nobles can't eat pork? Scholar Sunny defended himself. If you are willing, please allow me to prepare a lunch with pork as the main ingredient for you. I believe that you will be very surprised to find that you may have missed out on a delicious dish. Vera wanted to say that she had tasted wild boars before and that it did not taste good. However, Colin directly nodded and agreed to Sunny's suggestion. Okay, then I will have to trouble you. Scholar Sunny immediately invited them excitedly, please come with me, my two distinguished guests. It was still a little early for lunch, but Scholar Sunny personally went to the kitchen and urged the chefs to prepare a pork feast in order to recommend his farming and animal husbandry system to Vera and Colin. Not long after, the servants brought the lunch to the table. Vera's nose twitched a few times, and she found that there was no fishy smell as she had expected. Instead, there was a tempting fragrance. Duke, Lord Viscounts, please take a look. This is lemon-fried pork chop, charcoal grilled pork elbow, smoked pork loin, mashed potatoes, and red wine. Please try it. Vera was still a little hesitant, but Colin had already cut a piece of pork and put it into his mouth. It was crispy on the outside and tender on the inside. It was mellow and delicious, and it did not have the dry and fishy smell that she had expected. Colin's eyes lit up, and he seemed to have understood something. He asked, Scholar Sunny, have the wild boars that you have been raising been castrated? Scholar Sunny was slightly surprised, and then he smiled and said, Lord Viscounts, your knowledge is really admirable. Yes, these wild boars have indeed been castrated. Vera also tasted the pork feast in front of her at this time, and she immediately realized that the wild boar meat that she had eaten a long time ago was completely different from the wild boar meat that she had eaten a long time ago. She then asked curiously, does the wild boar meat taste better after being castrated? Yes, Duke. Scholar Sunny explained, after being castrated, not only does the pork taste better, but the wild boar's temperament also becomes gentler, which makes it easier to raise them in captivity. Colin nodded again and again. He also knew that after being castrated, the wild boar would evolve more toward the domestic pig that he remembered. He estimated that in a few more generations, he would be able to see the white and fat domestic pig that he had seen in his previous life. Scholar Sunny opened his mouth again and explained, Duke, the planting of sweet potatoes and the rearing of wild boars that I have advocated is actually a new farming and animal husbandry system that relies on each other and promotes each other. Sweet potato leaves can be used to feed the wild boars, and the feces of the wild boars can be used as a very good fertilizer to solve the problem of the sweet potatoes destroying the soil. The output of this new farming and animal husbandry system will definitely surprise you, and it will even completely change the diet of the entire empire's civilian class, and even their health. You may not be interested in these wild boars, but please don't forget, to the commoners, meat is a luxury. If you can make them eat pork as part of their daily diet, then I can guarantee that the people under your rule will be the strongest in the entire empire. Your army will also have the best soldiers. The more Scholar Sunny spoke, the more excited he became. It was a kind of glory and fanaticism that came from changing the world in one's own way. After Vera tasted Scholar Sunny's pork feast, she began to realize that with the passage of time, even the nobles would gradually accept this new type of pork. Even if it could not replace the position of cattle and sheep in the aristocratic banquets, it would still become an excellent supplementary meat. And for the civilians, this kind of pork was simply a gift from God. Due to the fact that cattle and sheep did not produce much meat, the price was extremely high. Therefore, very few civilians could eat beef and mutton in their daily diet. However, it was different for pork. If they really promoted the new farming and animal husbandry system according to Scholar Sunny's method, it would really be possible for the civilians' table to become more sumptuous. Thinking of this, Vera could not help but feel excited. She subconsciously looked at Colin, but she saw that her husband was frowning instead. Colin put down his knife and fork, wiped his mouth with a napkin, and solemnly looked at Scholar Sunny and asked in a deep voice. Scholar Sunny, you should tell us the truth now. If your new farming and animal husbandry system is really so perfect, then why did it encounter such strong resistance in Imperial Dragon City? Chapter 323. In the face of Colin's sharp question, Bachelor Sang Ni immediately calmed down. He realized that although the guardian of the northern frontier in front of him was young, he was not someone who could be easily fooled. Therefore, he slowly sat down at the opposite side of the table and nodded solemnly. Yes, this new farming and animal husbandry system that I have high hopes for does indeed have several fatal flaws. Vera was shocked and she immediately put down the knife and fork in her hand. She wiped her mouth with a napkin and was ready to listen carefully. Bachelor Sang Ni seemed to be worried that the two important people in front of him would lose confidence in his agricultural reform plan, so he quickly comforted them. But please rest assured that I have already thought about these flaws for a long time and I have already come up with some solutions. Colin nodded noncommittally and said, "Why don't you talk about the flaws first?" Okay. Bachelor Sang Ni cleared his throat and said frankly, "First of all, sweet potatoes have a fatal flaw. It is difficult to store them for a long time. Barley, wheat, and rice can be stored for 3 to 5 years as long as the method is correct. But sweet potatoes, even if they are dried, they can only be stored for half a year at most." Vera tilted her head and said in a puzzled manner, "This is not a big problem. After we finish eating sweet potatoes, we can just eat bread. It is not like we are not planting wheat anymore." Bachelor Sang Ni shook his head and said, "Duke, the problem is not this, but the tax." Tax? Vera did not understand. Colin's eyes narrowed and he immediately realized what kind of problem this would bring. The tax collection method in this world was very backward and it was generally used to offset taxes. For example, if the Lord of Winterspring Town implemented tithing in his territory, that was to say, all the output of the people here would have to be paid to the Lord. Those who planted wheat would have to hand over 1/10 of their barley, and those who raised cattle and sheep would have to hand over 1/10 of their cattle and sheep, as well as their leather, wool, and other items of recognized value. Therefore, if Scholar Sunny's new farming and animal husbandry system was promoted, the farmers in this system would have to hand over 1/10 of their sweet potatoes and pork. However, this involved a serious problem: sweet potatoes could not be stored for a long time. Of course, the Lord didn't collect these taxes for himself. No matter how many people there were in his family, they wouldn't be able to eat that much. These taxes were either used as strategic reserves, as military rations, or to exchange for goods they wanted in the market. In short, the taxes collected had to be able to be preserved for a long time. Sweet potatoes, on the other hand, had a fatal flaw in this regard. It was no wonder that Scholar Sunny's seemingly perfect agricultural reform plan was met with so much resistance in Imperial Dragon City. The nobles did not want their sweet potatoes to go bad so quickly. After listening to Bachelor Sang Ni's explanation, Vera finally understood what was going on. However, she immediately asked, "Then, is it possible for the citizens to exchange the sweet potatoes for copper coins and then use the copper coins to pay the tax?" "I'm afraid that's not possible." Scholar Sunny shook his head. "Why?" "Because we don't have enough copper coins." "You don't have enough copper coins?" Vera was even more puzzled. She had no choice but to look at Colin for help. Colin also nodded with a dignified expression on his face as he said, "Indeed, if we ask the citizens to use copper coins to pay the tax, it may seem more convenient for the Lord, but in fact, this will greatly reduce the amount of copper coins circulating in the market. On the other hand, the farmers who have adopted the new agricultural and pastoral system will not be able to store sweet potatoes for a long time. Therefore, they will inevitably sell some of the sweet potatoes that they can't finish and buy wheat that is easier to store. As a result, the demand for copper coins in the market will increase. The demand for copper coins will increase, but the supply will decrease. The more successful the new agricultural and pastoral system is, the greater the impact it will have on the existing monetary system, and it may even cause deflation." Colin was almost certain that deflation would happen. This was because the world was originally dominated by a natural economy. Therefore, the farmers almost didn't use copper coins on a daily basis. This was because they were all farming their own land. Therefore, they didn't have to pay taxes on their harvests. However, the new agricultural and pastoral system was different. The farmers had to trade their sweet potatoes. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to finish eating their sweet potatoes. This would greatly stimulate the market's activity. If the money supply couldn't keep up, the consequences would be extremely bad. However, Vera didn't understand these things at all. She blinked her cute big eyes and was even more puzzled. Scholar Sunny was also curious about Colin's new term, deflation. Sir Viscounts, what do you mean by that? Colin coughed a few times before he said lightly, it means that the currency circulating in the market is not enough. Instead, copper coins have become a rare commodity. Its value has risen sharply, and the prices have fallen. The people who have copper coins are not willing to exchange them, and finally, the entire trading market can't operate normally. Scholar Sunny looked at Colin in amazement. It seemed that he didn't expect that the young Viscounts would have such a deep understanding of the economy. Then, can't we mint more copper coins? Vera asked again. Scholar Sunny nodded and said, yes, this is indeed a way. However, the Empire of Light's minting power is in the hands of the royal family. Therefore, you must first obtain the consent of the royal family. Moreover, I must remind you that minting copper coins is actually a thankless task. This is because the cost of minting copper coins is higher than their value. The people of this world might not understand the economic operation as well as Colin, but they also understood the importance of the right to mint coins. Therefore, it was not a simple matter to obtain the right to mint coins from the royal family. When Scholar Sunny's new agricultural and pastoral system was rejected, it showed that the royal family didn't want to change the current currency system. In fact, even if Colin obtained the right to mint copper coins, he didn't want to do it. This was because, as Scholar Sunny had said, minting copper coins was a thankless task. It would only increase the burden of the House of St. Hilda. However, Colin had other ways to solve the problem of the shortage of money. This was thanks to his experience in his previous life, where he was used to the various operations of businessmen in the developed market economy. Therefore, he smiled and said, we don't have to mint copper coins. Scholar Sunny's eyes narrowed and he quickly asked, Sir Viscounts, do you have a better way? Colin smiled and nodded. Yes, we can borrow money from the merchants. Borrow money? Scholar Sunny was suddenly confused. He didn't understand what borrowing money had to do with increasing the money supply. Colin smiled confidently and explained leisurely, we can use the name of the House of St. Hilda to borrow money from the merchants in the northern frontier. And the thing we need to borrow is food. Previously, when the northern frontier was in famine, I know that many merchants had secretly stockpiled a large amount of food. They were waiting for the food prices to rise to make a big profit. Originally, I wanted to wait until I returned to the northern region to teach these fellows a lesson for trying to profit from the country's disaster. But now, it seems that we can use a gentler method and borrow a large amount of food from these merchants. Vera couldn't help but wonder, Colin, does this have anything to do with what we are talking about now? Of course, listen to me slowly. Colin smiled and comforted her. When these merchants lend us their food, the House of St. Hilda will issue a batch of bills with the family emblem. Well, let's call them bonds. Moreover, you will also announce in public as the Dukes of the North that anyone who holds these bonds can come to the Lion's Roar Fort to exchange for food of equivalent value after the debt matures. Vera was still confused. Her cute big eyes blinked as she looked at Colin. It seemed that she didn't know how to ask questions. However, Scholar Sunny seemed to have realized something, and his eyes became brighter and brighter. Colin smiled and continued to explain, in this way, these bonds will be equivalent to food. Moreover, they will be guaranteed by the credit of the House of St. Hilda. Therefore, they will have the characteristics of the general equivalent. In simple terms, they can be used as currency. After that, we will announce that from now on, the taxes of the northern frontier must be paid in currency or bonds of equivalent value. Once there is a shortage of copper coins, believe me, people will definitely use these bonds as a medium of exchange. In this way, although we will not be minting new coins, we will actually increase the supply of currency circulating in the market. Scholar Sunny stood up excitedly. His face was flushed red as he said loudly, "Lord Viscounts, you are really a genius." After that, he paced back and forth in the dining hall. It seemed that he was carefully thinking about the feasibility of this method. Vera twined her hair around her fingers. She seemed to understand what Colin meant. However, after pacing back and forth for a long time, Scholar Sunny suddenly stopped and asked, "Lord Viscounts, I think that there may be a problem with your method." "Tell me." "The loans that the House of St. Hilda borrowed from the merchants will have to be paid off. Once they are paid off, won't these bonds be withdrawn from the market?" "Who said that the loans must be paid off?" Colin said in a faint tone, "We can borrow new debts to pay off the old debts and maintain this debt forever." Scholar Sunny was stunned. Vera was also a little hesitant. This was because in this world, borrowing money was not a glorious thing, especially for the nobles. It could be said that it was a shame for them to owe money to those lowly merchants. Now that the situation in the northern frontier was special, it was reasonable to ask the House of St. Hilda to borrow some money to solve the emergency. However, if the debt continued, it would be a great blow to the prestige of the House of St. Hilda. Colin looked at the changes in the expressions of the two men and laughed in his heart. He knew that a certain number one rogue country on earth had also borrowed a lot of money, but would anyone dare to look down on it? "Believe me, a reasonable debt is not a burden, but a blessing." Colin said the famous words of Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury of the United States. In fact, Colin's way of issuing bonds bypassed the royal family's right to mint money. In fact, it was equivalent to privately issuing circulating currency. And if he could hold the right to issue currency in his hands, how much profit and influence would it generate? Of course, Colin was well aware of this. Why did the Federal Reserve like to buy U.S. bonds every time there was a financial crisis? Wasn't it to inject a large amount of liquid U.S. dollars into the market in this way to increase the money supply and thus cause inflation? It was also called quantitative easing. In fact, it was just printing money like crazy. But there was no other way. After all, the Federal Reserve was indeed paying off the debt in this way. Colin's inspiration actually came from this. He borrowed food from the merchants and issued bonds of equivalent value. Then, he endorsed these bonds with the credit of the House of St. Hilda. Coupled with the fact that these bonds could be used as tax credits, these bonds had the function of currency. In this way, the House of St. Hilda could dilute and harvest the wealth of the merchants on the northern frontier and even the nobles of the entire empire through this method. However, with the nobles of this world's superficial understanding of finance, they should not be able to understand the true power of this method. Of course, this world was still dominated by the natural economy and not a market economy. Therefore, there was no way to fully exert the power of currency issuance. However, as long as this method could be implemented smoothly, Colin was confident that the northern frontier could quickly recover from famine and war. He was even confident that the gap between them and the other three territories could quickly be widened. Vera looked at Colin's confident face. Although she did not fully understand the true meaning of this plan, it did not prevent her from fully supporting her husband as always. As for Bachelor Sang Ni, this guy could not wait to implement his new farming and animal husbandry system in the northern frontier. Even if he had some doubts about Colin's solution, he would not voice them out at this time. When Colin saw that the two of them no longer had any objections, he suddenly sent a formal invitation to Bachelor Sang Ni. "Bachelor Sang Ni, I wonder if you would like to go to the northern frontier and serve as an agricultural consultant for the House of St. Hilda?" Scholar Sang Ni's expression turned solemn. His gaze towards Colin finally carried a trace of respect and reverence from the bottom of his heart. he said in a deep voice, "I would like to." Chapter 324. Winterspring Castle was the central castle of Baron Grantu. It stood by the Winterspring River, at the southernmost point of Winterspring Town. It had a history of more than 100 years. The castle was built with limestone. The thick and sturdy walls were 25 meters tall. The walls were smooth without any gaps. The moat outside the walls was connected to the Winterspring River. The surface of the moat was sparkling, and there were fish and prawns jumping out from time to time. A large iron oak drawbridge spanned across the 10-meter-wide surface of the river. A few strong soldiers stood guard by the winch. Once the guards on the watchtower sounded the alarm, they could pull the drawbridge up at any time. The Grantu family was once glorious. It was said that 500 years ago, they were one of the most prominent earl families in the Flame territory. Winterspring Town back then was not as desolate as it was now. It was a town with more than 300,000 people living in it. Unfortunately, when the army of the Second Orc Empire invaded the Flame territory, Winterspring Town was unfortunately in their way. After that, the town became a pile of ruins. The Grantu family lost their title because of that. It was not until 100 years ago that the descendants of this family finally rose up and regained their title. Although it was only a baron, it was still a start. Winterspring Town and Winterspring Castle were rebuilt, but they were no longer as prosperous as before. Therefore, when the luxurious carriages of the House of St. Hilda slowly drove into Winterspring Town, the residents here looked at them with curiosity and respect. Baron Grantu had already arrived at the town and welcomed the Duke of St. Hilda and the rest into the castle. Although they were once glorious, this glory had long been worn away by the long river of time. The Grantu family now was no different from the other nobles in the countryside. When Baron Grantu's younger brother, Scholar Sunny, was appointed as the Minister of Agriculture, the Baron thought that the opportunity for the family to revive had finally arrived. Unfortunately, his younger brother was soon suppressed and opposed by various parties because of an agricultural reform plan. In the end, he even lost his own position. After this setback, Baron Grantu became even more pragmatic and low-key. This time, the Duke of St. Hilda suddenly came to visit. Although he was full of doubts, he still held the warmest welcome ceremony. He purposely ordered his men to wash away the moss on the city walls, clean up the interior of the castle thoroughly, and lay out the newly purchased red carpet. He even summoned his personal guards to act as ceremonial guards. He had to let the Duke of St. Hilda feel the sincerity of the Grand family. Unfortunately, the Grantu family was only a baron. Even though the study room in the Winterspring Castle was spacious, the low ceiling gave off an oppressive feeling. The narrow windows could only let in a little bit of sunlight, so they had to rely on candles to brighten up the room. Only the thick mahogany table exuded the smell of time, which could slightly reflect the heritage of the Grantu family. Baron Grantu sat on the sofa, looking a little reserved. Although Colin and Vera were elegant and modest, the noble aura that they exuded made Baron Grantu feel a little ashamed. Moreover, Prince Harrison and Princess Judy were beside him. Although they did not talk much, they were still the heirs of the Empire, and they gave Baron Grantu a lot of pressure. "Your Excellency Duke, Your Excellency Viscounts, please try the mushroom tea. This is a specialty of our Grantu territory." The silver cup on the long table was steaming, and the tea inside smelled like meat soup. However, it was not greasy when it entered the mouth. Instead, it tasted fresh and delicious. "It has a very unique taste," Vera praised politely. Baron Grantu was shocked, and he quickly explained, "Your Excellency Duke, I'm glad that you like it. This mushroom tea is made with red mushrooms from the dark forest and the spring water from the upper reaches of the Winterspring River. Unfortunately, it is not convenient to store it, otherwise, I would definitely give you some." "Can't the red mushrooms be stored after they are dried?" Colin asked with a smile. Baron Grantu shook his head and said, "Your Excellency Viscounts, red mushrooms alone are not enough. It must be made with the spring water from the upper reaches of the Winter Spring River in order to have such a unique taste. Colin secretly laughed at Baron Grantu's lack of business sense. He was too honest. It was no wonder that he was so poor and his family could not regain the glory of the past. However, he was not interested in teaching Baron Grantu, so he changed the topic and told him the purpose of their trip. Your Excellency Baron, we are here in Winter Spring Town to visit Scholar Sunny. You must know that there is a famine in the northern frontier right now, and we would like to invite Scholar Sunny to the northern frontier to implement agricultural reforms to alleviate the food crisis. Therefore, we hope that you can understand and support us. Hearing Colin say that he came to Winter Spring Town to visit his brother, Baron Grando could not help but feel disappointed. However, he quickly adjusted his mood. He knew that he was just a small baron and he did not have the qualifications to be visited by the Dukes of the North. Baron Grantu was indeed an honest man. He was not jealous of his brother at all. Instead, he was really happy for him and felt that his brother finally had the opportunity to show off his skills. Of course. It is Sunny's honor to be chosen by the House of St. Hilda. As long as he does not have any objections, I will not stop him. Scholar Sunny looked at his brother and suddenly said, Your Excellency Duke, may I take the liberty to ask for a condition? Vera smiled and nodded, Please go ahead. The thing is, I will be bringing a group of apprentices to the northern frontier as assistants. However, these people are after all the people of Grantu territory. If they leave, there will definitely be a shortage of labor here. Therefore, I hope that you can give the Grantu family a batch of slaves as compensation. That's what I should do. Vera immediately nodded and looked at Colin. Colin also nodded. This request was not too much. He then asked, How many slaves do you need? Scholar Sunny thought for a while and said, I will be bringing about 100 apprentices to the northern frontier this time. Therefore, you can use the same number of slaves in exchange. Colin shook his head and said, No, I will use 3 times the number of slaves to exchange with the Grantu family. Since he was going to give a gift, he might as well give it to them. Moreover, the Grantu family had left a good impression on Colin and he was willing to make friends with a family like this. Thank you for your generosity. Scholar Sunny bowed respectfully. Baron Grantu was also very excited. Although 300 slaves was not a big gift for a baron, the friendly attitude that Colin had shown was what he really valued. If he could use Scholar Sunny as a bridge and establish a connection with the House of St. Hilda, Baron Grantu felt that there was still hope for his family to revive. Your Excellency Baron, can I borrow your study room to write a letter to me? I will ask Ice Stone City to send the slaves to Winter Spring Town as soon as possible. Of course. Baron Grantu led Colin to the writing desk and even helped him spread out a roll of parchment paper. However, Colin's gaze was fixed on a pile of strange papers at the corner of the writing desk and he did not speak for a long time. Baron Grantu also noticed this and explained with a smile, Lord Viscounts, that is a little toy that my servant made when he was bored. It is quite convenient to use for writing, but it is not very suitable for your honorable status. However, Colin did not think that it was a little toy. He knew that the nobles of this world used parchment paper to write. As for the commoners, they definitely could not afford the expensive parchment paper and instead used a type of papyrus paper. Colin had seen this type of papyrus paper before. It was coarse and inconvenient to write on, completely incomparable to the paper he used in his previous life. Unfortunately, he did not remember how to make paper, or else he could have used this skill to make a fortune. However, right now, in Baron Grantu's study room, Colin actually saw something similar to paper. Although this type of paper was still slightly yellowed and the surface was not smooth enough, it was already very close to the paper Colin used in his previous life. He immediately threw away the parchment paper in front of him and picked up a piece of yellowed paper with interest and started writing on it. Seeing this, although Baron Grantu was confused, he did not say anything. After he finished writing the letter, Colin nodded in satisfaction and said to Baron Grantou, "Can I meet the craftsman who made this paper for you?" Chapter 325. Claude. Claude. Shouts came from the field. A middle-aged man dressed as a servant ran over, panting. He pulled Claude up and ran towards Winterspring Castle. "Uncle Mark, what's going on?" Claude asked in confusion as he ran. "Master wants to see you." "Oh, no, it's an honorable guest who wants to see you." "Quick, run faster." "Why does an honorable guest want to see me?" "I don't know." Claude saw that he could not get anything out of him, so he could only suppress his anxiety and run back to the castle as fast as he could. Once he entered the door, the solemn butler immediately ordered, "Men, bring Claude to freshen up, and prepare a set of decent clothes for him." Before Claude could ask in detail, he was led to the washroom by two burly maids. This was the first time in Claude's life that he was served by others. Even though the two maids were old enough to be his mother, he was at a loss throughout the entire process. After a while, when Claude walked out of the washroom again, he had already become a handsome and elegant young man. "Follow me." The butler appeared again and led Claude to the dining hall. Claude looked at the completely changed dining hall in a daze. Exquisitely carved mahogany furniture replaced the old ones. Golden candlesticks sat in the corner of the hall, filled with snow-white candles. The coarse linen curtains were all replaced with brand new cashmere curtains. It looked like an honorable guest had really arrived. Claude looked at the servants, who could not wait to gather the most luxurious decorations in the entire castle into this dining hall. He began to feel uneasy. Why does such an honorable guest want to see me? "Claude." A young lady walked in from the entrance of the dining hall. She was wearing a red linen dress, and her hair was tied up in a bun that accentuated her slender neck. Her face was slightly powdered, softening her overly masculine facial features. "Miss Kelly." Claude's eyes lit up, and he hurriedly greeted her. "You should call me Madam, Claude." Kelly smiled and nodded. She then turned serious and warned, "The Duke of St. Hilda and Viscount Angley want to see you later. Answer whatever they ask you. Don't talk too much, and don't be rude." "Yes, Mrs. Kelly." Claude hurriedly lowered his head and replied. Kelly was the daughter of Baron Grantou. She was already married, but unfortunately, her husband had met with misfortune during a hunting trip. She was widowed at a young age and returned to Winterspring Town sadly. Claude really wanted to ask Lady Kelly why the two distinguished guests wanted to see him, but he didn't dare to open his mouth. He just kept peeking at the young woman beside him from the corner of his eyes. The faint rose scent lingered in his nose, causing Claude's uneasy heart to suddenly heat up. Kelly noticed that Claude was peeking at her, but she didn't say anything. She just turned around and started chatting with the butler. Even if she was a widow who had been married once, she was still not someone a commoner like Claude could match. As time passed, the servants entered in a single file, bringing all sorts of delicacies into the dining room. There were roasted golden pork legs, salmon sprinkled with spices, fragrant steaks, a variety of selected fruits, and wine that had been stored for many years. At around 6:00, Baron Grantou led the distinguished guests into the dining room. After the guests and the host were seated, Baron Grantou made a toast. He also introduced the dishes on the table to Vera and Colin enthusiastically, especially the dishes that were mainly made with pork. Colin certainly knew that Baron Grantou was helping his younger brother, Scholar Sonny, to promote the new farming and animal husbandry system. As he smiled and responded, he thought that the relationship between the Grantou brothers was really good. At least, it was much more sincere than the other pairs of brothers that Colin had met in the past 2 years. Scholar Sonny did not speak much. Perhaps he felt that his brother was exaggerating a little too much. He even secretly stared at Baron Grantou a few times, as if he was trying to tell Baron Grantou to stop promoting the new products since they had already sold them, Baron Grantot seemed to have understood his brother's hint and he finally restrained himself. He then changed the topic and pointed at Claude, who was sitting at the end of the long table. "Lord Viscounts, didn't you say that you wanted to meet the papermaker of the Grantot family? This is Mr. Claude." Claude seemed to be in a daze. It was only when Hans kicked him under the table that he came back to his senses. When he realized that everyone was looking at him, he was shocked. He hurriedly stood up and bowed in greeting. Colin carefully looked at the young servant and asked gently, "Mr. Claude, I heard that you were the one who invented the yellow paper in the Baron's study room?" Claude quickly stuttered and said, "Yes, no. Lord Viscounts, it was actually invented by my father. I just made some changes." Lord Viscounts, Claude's grandfather, is the papermaker of Winterspring Castle. His family has been serving the Grantot family for almost 100 years. They are very dedicated and very competent, Baron Grantot took the opportunity to explain. At the same time, he did not forget to help his servant boast. Colin nodded. He looked at Claude and asked, "May I ask, how did you make that yellow paper?" Claude quickly replied, "Lord Viscounts, I used mulberry bark and linen cloth. I first steamed it, then cut it and pounded it into pulp. After that, I sifted the pulp and formed it into thin paper. Finally, I dried it under the sun." Colin was a little surprised that the young papermaker had explained in such detail. However, the people of this era did not have much awareness of patents. Claude probably did not know how valuable his invention was. Of course, no matter how valuable it was, it did not have much to do with Claude. He was a servant of the Grantot family. Strictly speaking, this papermaking technique belonged to the Grantot family. "Mr. Claude, this papermaking technique is a great invention. I admire your intelligence and ability," Colin praised. He then turned to Baron Grantot and said, "Lord Baron, I would like to purchase this secret papermaking technique. I wonder if you would be willing to part with it." In fact, Colin wanted to buy the papermaking technique not only to make money, but also to issue bonds. Initially, Colin was worried. If he wanted bonds to be circulated and become a shadow currency, he would need a sufficient amount and face value. If he were to use parchment paper to write them, the cost would be too high. However, if he were to use the paper invented by Claude, then there would be no problem at all. Colin could tell from the papermaking process that the cost of the paper would not be high. Moreover, if only the House of St. Hilda mastered the papermaking technique, it could prevent others from counterfeiting the bonds. It could be said that it was killing two birds with one stone. Of course, Baron Grantot did not realize the true value of this papermaking technique. "You don't have to invest in it. Just treat it as a gift from me to the House of St. Hilda." Colin was a little embarrassed by the other party's generosity. Colin felt that it was not right to take advantage of an honest person. "How about this, Lord Baron, if you transfer this papermaking technique to me, I will give you 30% of the money earned from it in the future." "You are too generous." Seeing Colin's insistence, Baron Grantot did not reject him. However, he would never have imagined that he had unintentionally brought a huge amount of wealth to the Grantot family. After that, Baron Grantot instructed Claude, "Claude, since the Viscounts has bought this papermaking technique, then you can follow us to the northern frontier." Colin was overjoyed when he saw that the deal was done. He asked Claude, "Mr. Claude, I admire your intelligence. I wonder if you are willing to follow me to the northern frontier? I can guarantee that you will have a chance to show off your talents there." Claude didn't dare refuse and hurriedly nodded in agreement. However, he secretly glanced at Madame Kelly from the corner of his eyes. Unfortunately, Madame Kelly wasn't even looking at the little papermaker. Hence, Claude quickly lowered his head and hid the unwillingness in his heart. Colin noticed this small detail and laughed in his heart. However, he would not help to set them up. After all, with Claude's current status, it was impossible for him to get involved. However, it might not be long before Claude had the right to marry the Baron's daughter. Chapter 326. As the sun set, more than a dozen white swans flew across the rippling surface of the golden lake, shattering the reflections in the lake. Teacher. Are the baby swans really ugly when they are young? Princess Judy, who had just finished listening to The Ugly Duckling, asked in a delicate voice. Colin did not understand this, so he could only answer casually, some are ugly, some are beautiful, just like human babies. There is always a difference between beauty and ugliness. Then, does it mean that those who are beautiful when they are young will be even more beautiful when they grow up? Judy's big eyes suddenly sparkled as she asked again. Colin glanced at the little girl and seemed to have seen through her little thoughts. He smiled and nodded. Yes. Judy immediately beamed with joy. Vera held her husband's hand and looked at the city on the other side of the lake. Suddenly, she asked, Colin, are we really not going to Swan City? Colin shook his head. No, let's not go. We have to go back to Winter City as soon as possible. There are still a lot of things waiting for us there. Okay. Vera nodded gently. She was not a very opinionated woman, especially after Colin proved his ability time and time again. Vera was even more dependent on her husband. They had now left the Flaming Flame territory and entered the northern frontier. However, along the way, other than stopping at Winter Spring town of the Granta family, Colin took the wilderness path when passing by other territories. He did not enter any of the lords' castles along the way. Of course, the lords along the way would send envoys to invite the new Duke of St. Hilda out of respect. Colin and the others had just stopped by the lake and were about to set up camp when the envoy from Swan Castle arrived. Moreover, the identity of this envoy was not ordinary. It turned out to be the eldest son of Count Schultz of Swan City, Viscount Thorin. In the vassal system of the House of St. Hilda, there were three major count families, the Ullman family of Fallen Eagle City, the Morrison family of Floral City, and the Schultz family of Swan City. Of course, there was also Earl Dawson, but he was actually a vassal of Marquis Garcia. After the First Northern Frontier Rebellion, he was conferred the title of Marquis and became a vassal of the House of St. Hilda. Colin had already dealt with the Oman family and the Morrison family. Only the Schultz family was unfamiliar to Colin. Actually, Colin had met Count Schultz once in Icestone City. At that time, during the suzerain's conference, the major families of the northern frontier joined forces to force the Duke of St. Hilda to depose Marquis Charles. Colin remembered that during that meeting, only the previous Count Morrison had refused to sign the petition and had been killed. Count Schultz and Count Oman had both signed the petition. Afterwards, the Duke of St. Hilda had rudely rejected the request of the suzerains, causing the two sides to fall out completely. Of course, the Schultz family had also participated in the attack on the Golden Lion Legion. In the end, the Schultz family's troops were scattered by the Golden Lion Legion and the Black Cavalry, suffering heavy losses. However, in the Great Purge that followed, Count Schultz didn't seem to have been punished. At least, her title didn't change. As for why the Duke of St. Hilda let Count Schultz go, there were many speculations in the northern frontier. The most convincing one was that Count Schultz had married a good husband. This Count Schultz's husband was called Lucien. Yes, he only had a given name, but no surname. He was a commoner. But at the same time, he was also a warrior of the sixth step. Just like the other warrior of the sixth step who became the son-in-law of the Oman family, Lucien also successfully married a count of the northern frontier, successfully achieving a leap in rank. At that time, there were only two sixth-step professionals in the northern frontier, and they were Lucien and the Duke of St. Hilda. At that time, no one knew whether the Duke of St. Hilda had become a saint or not. But even if he had, he probably didn't want to reveal his true strength. Therefore, Duke St. Hilda spared Count Schultz, who was involved in the Lord's Rebellion, probably because he did not want to have a direct conflict with Lucien. However, the Schultz family didn't come out unscathed. After all, more than half of their most elite troops were killed outside Icestone City. It could be said that the Schultz family suffered a great loss. Therefore, in the Second Northern Frontier Rebellion caused by Mr. Xing, the Schultz family was no longer able to participate. They could only choose to be neutral and watch the whole process. It wasn't accurate to say that they were completely neutral, because Count Schultz's territory was located in the southernmost part of the northern frontier, bordering the Flaming Territory. If Marquis Menham, who was determined to build a kingdom of dwarves, wanted to send his troops to the northern frontier, he would definitely pass through Swan City. However, Count Schultz did not do anything and directly let the troops of the Menham family pass through. This was actually a betrayal of the northern frontier. Colin was planning to take his time to settle the score with the Schultz family, but he did not expect that they would have the nerve to take the initiative to send an invitation. However, Colin did not plan to enter Swan City at this time. It was not that he was afraid of the Tier 6 warrior. After all, as long as Count Schultz and Lucien were not crazy, they would never dare to do anything to Vera, who had become one of the Dukes of the North. He was just too lazy to pay attention to Count Schultz, who had once betrayed the House of St. Hilda. Your Grace, welcome to Count Schultz's territory. Mother ordered me to come here and sincerely invite you to Swan Castle. Viscount Sorin, who looked to be about 14 or 15 years old, said in a slightly childish voice. After that, he respectfully handed an invitation letter to Vera. Vera took the invitation letter and looked at Colin hesitantly. However, Colin slowly shook his head. Therefore, she gently refused, "Please apologize to Count Schultz for me. Due to the urgency of the situation, I have to rush back to Winter City as soon as possible. I'm afraid that I won't be able to visit Swan Castle." According to the usual practice, Viscount Sorin should have left at this time. However, he opened his mouth again and tried to persuade Vera. Your Grace, please forgive my rudeness, but it's already late. Isn't your convoy camping by the lake and preparing to rest here for the night? So, since you are going to stay here for the night, why don't you come to Swan Castle? The Schultz family has already prepared the most delicious food and the most luxurious room for you to rest in. Colin frowned. He felt that this Viscount Sorin was too much. Vera had already rejected him, but he still wanted to force her to stay. However, he did not know if this was Count Schultz's idea or if this young Viscount's was just being immature. Vera's face also became gloomy. She firmly shook her head and said, "I'm sorry. Next time." Viscount Sorin did not give up. Your Grace, I know that the Schultz family's performance during the Northern Frontier's turmoil did not satisfy you, but please believe that we were unable to do anything at that time. This time, my mother invited you to Swan Castle to apologize to you in person and ask for your forgiveness. Colin snorted and said coldly, "If Count Schultz is really sincere, then please go to Lion's Roar Castle and ask for the Duke's forgiveness." Viscount Sorin was stunned. After a while, he finally gritted his teeth and said in a low voice. Your Grace, in fact, my mother invited you to Swan Castle because she has something important to report to you. What is it? Just say it here, Vera replied coldly. Viscount Sorin was helpless. He lowered his voice and said, Bishop John of Swan City has disappeared. Disappeared? Yes. Bishop John has disappeared for 3 days without any news. My father personally led a team to search Swan City, but they did not find anything. Vera's face changed slightly. She looked at Colin with a grave expression. Colin also frowned. The disappearance of a bishop could be a serious matter. However, Vera was one of the Dukes of the North. Since she was passing by Swan City, it would be inappropriate for her to not ask about it. However, Colin did not want Vera to have too much contact with the church. After all, it was hard to tell how much the Pope's theurgy affected Vera. Colin could not help but wonder if this was a trick directed by the church. When he thought of this, Colin stepped forward and replied, Your Grace, you need to hurry back to Winter City. You really can't stay in Swan City. How about this? I will go back with you and find out what happened. Viscount Thorin looked at the calm Colin and then at the silent Vera. He could only nod and say, yes. Okay, then I will have to trouble you, Sir Viscounts. Colin nodded. He turned around and whispered in Vera's ear, you can rest by the lake for the night. You will continue your journey tomorrow. Don't wait for me. Vera nodded obediently and said, okay. You be careful too. Chapter 327. Swan City stood on the shore of Swan Lake. The moat was connected to the lake. From afar, the majestic city looked like a small island in the middle of the lake. The dark green city walls were reflected in the lake. Under the light of the setting sun, reality and illusion, majesty and gentleness, formed a beautiful scene. When Colin arrived at Swan City with Viscount Sorin, he found that Countess Schultz was already waiting for them outside the city. Countess Schultz was wearing a light blue palace dress. She was tall and well-proportioned, with black hair and black eyes. Her facial features were delicate, and there was no trace of age on her. Colin dismounted from his horse and bowed. Your Excellency Countess Schultz, may your beauty last forever. Welcome to Swan City, Your Excellency Viscount Angley, the guardian of the northern frontier. Countess Schultz smiled sweetly. Her tone was kind and gentle, as if she was not unhappy about Vera's refusal to come to Swan City. The Countess had a gentle temperament and was very approachable. Even if Colin had some opinions about the Schultz family, they almost disappeared under the Countess' gentle smile. This is my husband, Lucien. Countess Schultz pointed at a middle-aged man with a rough face and introduced him to Lucien. The corner of Lucien's mouth twitched into a smile, but his attitude was not very warm. It was not clear whether it was because he had some opinions about Colin, or because he was not good at socializing. Colin did not mind. He smiled and nodded at Lucien as a greeting. As the strongest person on the northern frontier, Lucien had the right to be proud. After that, Countess Schultz introduced Colin to the important people behind her. Colin smiled and greeted them one by one, but in reality, he did not remember many of their names. After some small talk, Countess Schultz led Colin into Swan City. This time, Colin had only brought a dozen or so guards with him. Of course, this was only the strength he had on the surface. There were still more than 100 blood thralls hiding outside the city. Swan City had always had the reputation of being the most beautiful city in the northern frontier. The buildings in the city were painted a uniform white, and the roads were paved with bluestone slabs. There was even a green belt in the middle of the road, where tall sycamore trees were planted. However, in Colin's opinion, Swan City's beauty was a little artificial. It wasn't as natural as Silvermoon City. Of course, among the cities in the northern frontier, Swan City was considered outstanding. Compared to it, Winter City was more majestic but less graceful. Colin looked at Swan Castle not far away and asked with a smile, Earl, why don't we go directly to the Radiance Church? Don't you want to have dinner first? Let's go take a look at the place where Bishop John went missing first. Otherwise, I won't be in the mood to eat with this question hanging in my mind. Count Schultz didn't try to persuade him any further. He smiled gently and praised, all right, your dedication is admirable. Then, the convoy slowly changed direction and soon arrived in front of the Radiance Church. Four white-robed pastors welcomed Colin and the rest into the prayer hall. Count Schultz introduced the church to Colin as they walked. According to the pastors in the church, Bishop John went missing as usual on the night. After he finished the last mass, he went back to his room to rest. However, the next morning, the servants who came to help him wash up found that Bishop John was not in his room. Then, the pastors searched the church but found nothing. They could only report this to me. I also sent the city defense army to search the entire city. I even had Lucien personally lead a team to search the vicinity of Swan City. However, there was still no trace of Bishop John. Colin nodded and said to the pastor who led the way, can you bring us to Bishop John's room? Of course, this way please. The few of them followed the pastor through the long corridor and arrived at the inner courtyard. Lord Viscount, this is Bishop John's room. We've investigated it carefully before, and there are no traces of fighting or abnormalities. Colin walked around the room and suddenly asked with a smile, did Bishop John forget to tell you that he was going somewhere far away? Count Schultz also smiled and said, that seems to be the most reasonable explanation. Colin rubbed his nose, wondering if this was really a self-directed trick by the church. Bishop John knew that Vera was going to pass by Swan City, so he deliberately went missing to trick Vera into entering the city? But what was the use of that? Colin's eyes swept across the faces of the people in the room one by one. He asked again, on the night the bishop went missing, did he come into contact with anyone strange? Strange people? Yes, or people you don't know. The pastors thought for a while, and then one of them suddenly said, a strange knight came to the church and confessed to the bishop. A strange knight? Count Schultz was also interested. Didn't any of you recognize which family he was from? The pastor shook his head and said, the knight was injured. Most of his face was covered with a white cloth, so I didn't recognize him. However, Bishop John seemed to know him and accepted his confession. Colin immediately said, can you take us to the confession room? The pastor nodded and then led the group out of the bishop's room and to the confession room at the side of the prayer hall. The confession room was very small, and the decoration inside was also very simple. There were 2 chairs in the middle, separated by a wooden wind shield. For the Church of Light, this was the closest place to God. It was also the only place where they could open their hearts, confess their sins, and pray to God for repentance. Count Schultz looked at the confession room for a while, but he didn't seem to notice anything unusual. He then asked, did anything unusual happen after Bishop John finished confessing? The pastor thought for a while and shook his head. Nothing unusual. After that, he even presided over the Mass. His behavior was no different from usual. Count Schultz said to his husband, maybe we should ask the city defense officer to see if any injured knight has entered Swan City recently. Lucien nodded and said, okay, I'll ask him later. Seeing that Colin was silent, Count Schultz asked, Sir Viscounts, did you find anything? Colin was a bit surprised, but then he shook his head and smiled. No. Count Schultz took a deep look at Colin and invited him, then let's go back to Swan Castle for dinner. Okay. They then left the church and entered Swan Castle. At this time, it was already late. Crystal candlesticks and chandeliers were hanging in the corner of the banquet hall. The attentive servants had already prepared a table full of delicacies to entertain the distinguished guests who came from afar. After the banquet, Colin was led by a young maid to the room prepared for him by the Count. After washing up, Colin did not go to bed immediately. Instead, he quietly left Swan Castle and returned to the Radiance Church. In the prayer hall of the church, the pastors were directing the choir to sing hymns. When one of them saw Colin, he immediately greeted him. Sir Viscounts, is there anything I can do for you? Colin pointed in the direction of the side hall and said, I want to check the confession room again. Is there anyone inside? No. Are you going to confess? No, I'll take a look myself. You don't have to worry about me. Okay. After sending the pastors away, Colin went to the confession room alone. After closing the door, Colin sat down in his seat. The confession room was very quiet. Lucien could vaguely hear the choir singing from the prayer hall next door. Colin took a deep breath and once again smelled the faintly discernible scent of blood. The smell was very faint. Looking at the reaction of Count Schultz and the pastors, it was clear that they did not notice the smell of blood at all. If not for Colin's extreme sensitivity to the smell of blood, he might have missed this important clue. It was this smell that made him return. But just as Colin was about to take a closer look, he suddenly felt that something was wrong. Whoosh! He stretched out his hand and pulled open the curtain in the middle. He was surprised to find another person sitting in the seat opposite him. Colin's heart trembled. He showed a stiff smile and greeted. Good evening, Your Highness. Chapter 328. In the small confessional, Colin and Prince Lacy sat opposite each other. Neither of them spoke, and the silence in the air made one's heart palpitate. Under the scrutinizing gaze of this paladin, Colin felt as if all the secrets in his heart had nowhere to hide. The faint sound of the choir outside became more and more distant, and finally disappeared completely. It was as if the confessional was sealed in another space. Prince Lacy's aura was as deep as the sea. Even if he was just sitting beside him, he had the illusion that he would be swallowed by the huge waves at any time. Cold sweat seeped out from Colin's forehead. He could not help but ask, "Your Highness, are you here to confess?" Prince Lacy looked at Colin expressionlessly. After a while, he finally said, "What did you find?" Colin sighed inwardly and had no choice but to tell the truth. "I smell blood." "Blood?" Prince Lacy's nose twitched a few times. It was unknown whether he smelled it or not. Colin quickly added, "It's very faint, but I'm sure it's the smell of blood." Prince Lacy stared into Colin's eyes and asked, "Then why do you think there's the smell of blood?" Colin thought for a while and said, "The priest said that the strange paladin was wrapped in white cloth and seemed to be seriously injured. Maybe that's why there's a faint smell of blood." "Is that so?" Prince Lacy said lightly, "If it's because of this, why did you come back alone in the middle of the night?" Colin was speechless. Looking at Prince Lacy's increasingly dangerous eyes, Colin had no choice but to be honest, because I smelled a similar smell of blood in another place before. "Where?" Colin licked his lips and said with a smile, "Phoenix Butterfly Castle." "Golden-tailed Phoenix Butterfly Castle, Morrison family?" "Yes." Prince Lacy narrowed his eyes, as if he was examining whether Colin was lying this time. Colin looked back at him calmly. This time, he really did not lie. "Since you smelled something similar in the Phoenix Butterfly Castle, have you investigated the source?" Colin nodded and said half-truthfully, "Yes, I did. I once sneaked into the basement of the Phoenix Butterfly Castle's clock tower and found a terrifying blood pool there." "Blood pool?" Prince Rhy finally had a surprised expression on his face. "Yes. But I was worried that I would alarm the people of the Morrison family, so I immediately came out and didn't investigate further. Perhaps, you can go and make some inquiries." Colin was prepared to encourage this paladin to probe the mysterious and strange Morrison family. It would be best if he could expose this family's history. Prince Lacy lowered his head in silence. No one knew what he was thinking. Colin saw that the other party did not speak, so he mustered up his courage and asked, "Your Highness, may I ask why you are here? Is it also because of Bishop John's disappearance?" Prince Lacy raised his head again and said indifferently, "It was my lord who guided me here." The corner of Colin's mouth twitched slightly, and he was speechless. But then, Colin realized that perhaps Prince Lacy was not being perfunctory, but had really received the guidance of God. After all, there might really be some special connection between the paladins and the god of light. So, Colin asked again, "What else did my lord tell you? Tell me, maybe I can help you." However, this time, Prince Lacy did not answer. He just stared at Colin silently until he felt goosebumps all over his body. Just when Colin thought that he had offended Prince Lacy and was about to leave quickly, the other party suddenly spoke. "My lord's guidance told me that this Bishop John is related to the person who framed me." "Framed?" Colin asked thoughtfully. "Yes. I did not kill Consul Leadham. Someone framed me." "What? Who is so bold?" Colin tried hard to pretend to be shocked. Prince Lacy seemed to have seen through Colin's disguise. The corner of his mouth curled up slightly, and he asked, "You already knew, didn't you?" Colin coughed a few times to hide his awkwardness. He smiled and said, "Actually, it was just a guess. After all, the situation at that time, no matter how you look at it, it was a little deliberate. Moreover, I also believe that with your character, you would never do such a despicable thing." Prince Lacy's gaze softened a little. Perhaps he felt that he had finally found someone who understood him. He nodded in agreement and said, "That's right. So now I need to find the evidence that framed me and restore my reputation." "Then what does this have to do with Bishop John?" Colin asked doubtfully. Prince Lacy shook his head and did not speak. Colin was not sure if the other party did not know what it had to do with him, or if he did not want to tell him. "Then do you have a suspect for the person who framed you?" Colin asked tentatively. Prince Lacy glanced at Colin and said a name that shocked him, "Mr. Lacy." Mr. Lacy? Colin's eyes widened. "But wasn't he killed by you?" Originally, Colin thought that Prince Lacy would say the name of Emperor Reinhardt or Empress Medela. He did not expect that the other party would say the name of a dead person. "That's right. I did see him turn to dust with my own eyes. However, that does not mean that he is dead." Colin touched the tip of his nose. If it was anyone else who said this, he would definitely scold them. But facing a holy knight. "Fine, if you think that someone who was blasted to dust might not be dead, then he might not be dead. In the past few years, I have not fought much. The only time I used judgment was when I faced Mr. Lacy. I suspect that he used some kind of arcane technique to store my attack and then used it to kill Consul Leadham." Colin blinked. He found that this holy knight prince's imagination was really wild. However, if there really was such a miraculous arcane technique, then it would indeed explain how Empress Medela framed Prince Lacy. Perhaps Mr. Lacy could really research such an arcane technique. After all, he was the one who researched the mysterious forbidden spell, Trial's Eye. Prince Lacy looked into Colin's eyes and said seriously, "I know that you may not be on the same side as me, but Mr. Lacy's existence is a great threat to the northern frontier. So, if you have any news about him, please let me know immediately." "Okay." Colin agreed without hesitation. Prince Lacy was right. If Mr. Lacy was really alive, then Colin would definitely be one of the people who wanted to kill him the most. As long as this guy was alive, the northern frontier would never be truly peaceful. Seeing that Colin had agreed, Prince Lacy nodded, indicating that he could leave. Colin heaved a sigh of relief and hurriedly stood up to bow. But just as he was about to open the door, Prince Lacy's voice sounded again. "Right, let me give you one last piece of advice." Colin turned back and smiled respectfully, "Please speak." "Be careful of the Empress. She is a dangerous woman." After saying this, Prince Lacy closed his eyes and did not explain further. He did not seem to care whether Colin took his advice or not. Colin rubbed his nose, thinking that this was not a ploy to drive a wedge between them, right? But this method was too crude. "Thank you, Your Highness. I will keep your advice in mind." Chapter 329. It was late at night. Colin walked alone in the hallway of Swan Castle, occasionally passing by a few patrolling guards. Seeing Colin, the guards all stopped and saluted. Colin nodded absent-mindedly. After returning from the church, Colin was still thinking about the conversation he had with Prince Rhy in the confessional. Especially the news that Mr. Chi might still be alive, which made Colin feel an irresistible pressure. But then, Colin shook his head and laughed. He felt that he was worrying too much. After all, whether Mr. Chi was still alive or not was not confirmed. Even if it was true, with Prince Rhy in front of him, Colin did not have to worry about facing this terrifying opponent. Thinking of this, Colin's footsteps suddenly became a lot lighter. The air also seemed to have become sweeter. It wasn't as if, but there was really a sweet fragrance in the air. Colin curiously turned a corner and saw the open-air balcony at the end of the hallway. On the balcony, a beautiful figure was standing there alone. It was Countess Schultz. Tonight, the Countess was wearing a simple dress with a tight waist. She did not have any jewelry on her, but the dress was well-tailored, vividly outlining her slender and flexible body. In Colin's opinion, Countess Schultz was a mature, graceful, and charming model of a noble lady. She was dignified but not pretentious, beautiful but not frivolous and arrogant, and always had a very friendly smile on her face. Even though he knew that the loyalty of the Schultz family was questionable, Colin found it hard to dislike such an outstanding countess. Hearing Colin's footsteps, Countess Schultz turned her head and smiled sweetly. "Your Excellency Viscounts, did you go out for a walk?" "Yes, I couldn't sleep, so I went to the church to bare my heart to the Lord. I feel much better now," Colin replied with a smile, then walked forward and stood side by side with Countess Schultz. Swan Castle was built next to the lake. Looking out from the balcony, one could see Swan Lake under the night sky. The bright silver moon was reflected in the lake, ethereal and beautiful. "Yes, it's better to talk about some things," Count Schultz said meaningfully. Colin nodded his head in response. However, his eyes were looking across the vast lake and he could see a faint fire on the other side of the lake. That should be the place where Vera and the others were camping. Count Schultz followed Colin's gaze and seemed to understand something. He asked again, "Your Grace, are you unwilling to enter Swan City to express your dissatisfaction with the Schultz family?" Colin smiled and said, "Count, do you think the Duke of St. Hilda can still trust the Schultz family?" "That's right." What the Schultz family had done was indeed chilling. "However, I'm only targeting the former Duke of St. Hilda. I'm willing to offer unlimited loyalty to the current Duke of St. Hilda." Colin turned his head and looked at Count Schultz, who had a serious expression on his face. Count Schultz met Colin's gaze without flinching. The sincerity in his eyes did not seem to be fake. However, Colin would not be moved by a few words. Besides, he had seen many politicians with outstanding acting skills. Who knew if Count Schultz was one of them? "I will pass on your words to the Duke of St. Hilda," Colin said calmly. Count Schultz could see that Colin was just being perfunctory. He said again, "You don't trust me." "I just find it hard to trust someone who has betrayed His Majesty." A hint of sadness flashed in Count Schultz's eyes. He seemed to be hurt by Colin's words. After a while, he said, "Then do you know why I betrayed the former Duke of St. Hilda in Icestone City?" Colin was a witness to the rebellion of the Lords, so of course he knew the situation. However, looking at Count Schultz's expression, it seemed that there was more to his motive. "Is it not because of Marquis Charles's disastrous defeat at the front lines?" "Not exactly." Count Schultz shook his head slowly. "It's also because of Marquis Garcia." Colin's expression changed, but he was not too surprised. After all, Marquis Garcia had purposely expressed his dissatisfaction with his brother in order to incite the Lords to rebel. However, Count Schultz's next words gave Colin a fright. "Marquis Garcia is my lover." Colin looked at the beautiful countess beside him. The fire of gossip was ignited in his heart. "Back then, I thought that Garcia finally had the courage to rebel against his brother, so I joined the rebellion army." Who would have thought? I overestimated his courage. Colin looked at Count Schultz, who was gnashing his teeth, and did not know what to say for a moment. However, in his opinion, the Countess was probably overthinking things. Marquis Garcia was obviously more willing to cooperate with his brother to purge the lords of the northern frontier to consolidate the rule of the House of St. Hilda. At that time, even Colin was taken by Marquis Garcia to hunt outside the city. That was how they escaped the whirlpool of rebellion. However, Marquis Garcia did not inform Count Schultz. From this, it could be seen that Count Schultz was not that important to Marquis Garcia. Count Schultz seemed to have seen through Colin's thoughts. He immediately asked, "Do you think that I overestimated my position in Marquis Garcia's heart?" Colin touched his nose and said helplessly, "That's not it. I think that the reason why the Duke of St. Hilda's purge of the rebellious lords did not affect you was probably because Marquis Garcia pleaded on your behalf." Count Schultz's lips curved into a mocking smile. "Actually, you're not wrong to think that way. I'm afraid that I really overestimated my position in Marquis Garcia's heart. 20 years ago, I even foolishly thought that he would marry me. Who would have thought that when the Duke of St. Hilda only asked him to give up his command of the Black Cavalry in order to marry me, he hesitated. He even told me that he would give up his command of the Black Cavalry to marry me after he breached the Troll City. Haha, luckily I didn't wait for him. Otherwise, who knows how many years I would have wasted. Colin was a little surprised. He did not expect that Marquis Garcia and Count Schultz had actually reached the point of discussing marriage, only to be stopped by the Duke of St. Hilda. Of course, Colin could understand the Duke of St. Hilda's condition. After all, Marquis Garcia had the strongest army in the northern frontier. If he could obtain the help of the Schultz family, his power in the northern frontier would be too great. At that time, the Duke of St. Hilda should not have been promoted to the sanctuary realm yet. It was only natural that he would be wary of this. Perhaps in the heart of Marquis Garcia, achievements will always be placed before love. Count Schultz was still lamenting. Colin remained silent. It was not his place to express his opinion. However, he suddenly felt that his father-in-law might be hiding a lot of secrets. That is all in the past, and I have already let go of it. Count Schultz tucked a strand of hair behind his ear and changed the topic. However, there are still some things that I have to worry about. Colin turned his head in confusion and asked, "What is it?" "The fact that I gave birth to a daughter for him." "What?" Colin thought that he had heard wrong. Count Schultz nodded and said indifferently, "Yes, Vera is the daughter of Marquis Garcia and I. Later, she was adopted by the previous Duke of St. Hilda. So now you should understand why I said that the Schultz family would not betray the current Duke of St. Hilda, right?" Colin stared at Count Schultz in shock. His heart was in turmoil. What was going on? Wasn't Vera's biological mother Empress Medela? Immediately, Colin realized that he had been fooled by the Empress. What exchange of information? What did she mean by supporting Vera? It was all the Empress' little tricks. She had used this little trick to win Colin's trust and forced him to hand over his information in the name of an exchange. Colin felt a little relieved that he had not handed over his fatal information to the Empress. Otherwise, he would have been at Empress Medela's mercy in the future. At this time, he could not help but think of Prince Leon's advice, "Be careful of the Empress. She is a dangerous woman." Chapter 330. Why? You don't believe me? Count Schultz looked at the shocked expression on Colin's face and thought that he did not believe him. Colin let out a long sigh and shook his head. "It's not that I don't believe you. I just feel that this news is a little too shocking." "Why?" "Marquis Garcia gave you his two most precious things, Vera and the Black Cavalry. Has he never mentioned me to you?" Colin smiled bitterly and shook his head. "No. Marquis Garcia has never allowed me to ask more about Vera's birth mother. Is it because he feels guilty that he does not dare to mention me?" Maybe. In fact, Colin was more willing to believe Count Schultz because if Count Schultz was not Vera's biological mother, he would not have known that Marquis Garcia was Vera's biological father. After all, Marquis Garcia would not have told this secret to an unrelated person like Count Schultz. However, he might have told his own sister. Moreover, Queen Medela knew that Colin would not dare to ask Marquis Garcia directly because if Colin believed her, he would think that Vera was the product of incest. Therefore, he would not dare to ask Marquis Garcia directly. Therefore, he could only bury this secret in the bottom of his heart and believe that he had the Queen's secret. Colin was now more and more convinced that Queen Medela was lying to him in order to get hold of his secret so that she could control him. Phew, this woman was too scheming. However, if Count Schultz was Vera's biological mother, then things would be different. Although it was also a little difficult to talk about it, it was not as serious as incest. It was just an ordinary illegitimate daughter. Colin dared to ask Marquis Garcia directly. Since Count Schultz had told him this secret, he should not be afraid of confronting Marquis Garcia. Do you believe that I do not have any malicious intentions towards Vera now? Of course. Then, can I trouble you to invite Vera into the city? Count Schultz said sincerely, after so many years, I want to see my daughter. Colin hesitated for a moment before he asked, Earl Long, do you want to make your relationship with Vera public? Count Schultz asked carefully, may I? If Vera does not have any objections, then that is fine. Although this would cause Vera to be labeled as an illegitimate daughter, it would not have much of an impact on her. After all, everyone knew that Vera was an illegitimate daughter, but they did not know the identity of her biological parents. Besides, she had been adopted by the Duke of St. Hilda, so she already had the right to inherit. Even if Countess Schultz was her biological mother, it wouldn't be a big deal. That's great! Count Schultz exclaimed excitedly. A moment later, a blush appeared on her fair face and she said in a slightly shy tone. Please rest assured that I will try my best to help Vera clear her name as an illegitimate daughter. What do you mean? I am going to marry Marquis Garcia. Colin's jaw dropped again. He was once again shocked by Count Schultz's words. Earl Long. I would like to remind you that you are already married. Count Schultz nodded his head to indicate that he was not stupid. He then said in a matter-of-fact tone, I can get a divorce. When he saw that Colin was still in shock, Count Schultz continued. The reason why Marquis Garcia refused to marry me in the past was because he could not let go of the Black Cavalry. However, now that the Black Cavalry has become your blood cavalry, I would like to see if he has forgotten the promise he made back then. As for my husband, you don't have to worry about him. I have already given birth to a son for Garcia. As long as Marquis Garcia is willing to marry me, I can immediately pass the title of Count to Sorin. I believe that he will not object. The reason why he married me in the past was because of the Schultz family's property. Now that I have handed it over to his own son, he can't be more than happy. Colin blinked his eyes and looked at Count Schultz, who seemed to have turned into a young girl in love. For a moment, he did not know how to comment on her behavior. At the same time, he could not help but feel that Marquis Garcia's charm was so great that Count Schultz could not forget him even after so many years. Count Schultz was even willing to give up the title of Count in order to marry him. Do you think that Marquis Garcia will be willing to marry me? Count Schultz suddenly lost her confidence. Colin wiped the cold sweat off his forehead and smiled bitterly, I think so. After all, you have done so much for Marquis Garcia. If he doesn't marry you, it will be intolerable. Count Schultz seemed to be encouraged by Lucien's words. She suddenly smiled and looked no different from a young girl in love. Count Schultz, it's already late. I'll go back and rest now. I'll get up early tomorrow and go to the camp on the other side of the lake to bring Vera to Swan City. Thank you so much. This is what I should do. Colin bowed and then left. Count Schultz looked at the faint fire on the other side of the lake with a smile on his face, as if he was looking forward to the scene when he met his daughter tomorrow. Do you think he believes you? Suddenly, a deep male voice sounded. Count Schultz immediately turned around and bowed, I think so, Your Grace. The man was covered in a grey robe, and only his face could be seen. It was the Duke of St. Hilda, who was supposed to be dead. Will Vera enter the city tomorrow? Yes. Very good. The Duke of St. Hilda nodded with satisfaction and a faint smile appeared on his face. Tomorrow, you will publicly announce your relationship with Vera and prove that she is your daughter. Count Schultz hesitated and asked carefully, Your Grace, please forgive me for being presumptuous, but if I pretend to be Vera's mother, won't Marquis Garcia stand up and expose me? He won't dare to, the Duke of St. Hilda said with certainty. When the Duke of St. Hilda saw that the hesitation on Count Schultz's face had not completely disappeared, he added, because he won't dare to reveal the identity of Vera's real mother, you don't have to worry at all. No one will stand up and question you. From tomorrow onwards, you will be the mother of this generation of Dukes of the North. Count Schultz heaved a sigh of relief and asked, Your Grace, what should I do after that? After that, you will return to Winter City with Vera and propose to Marquis Garcia. Believe me, he won't dare to reject you. After the marriage, your most important task is to conceive a child of the House of St. Hilda. After you complete this task, I will tell you what to do next. Count Schultz frowned and hesitated. Your Grace, even if Marquis Garcia is forced to marry me, he might not even touch me. How can I conceive a child? The Duke of St. Hilda smiled faintly and said, You can rest assured that I will help you. Count Schultz raised his head and looked at the Duke of St. Hilda. A charming blush appeared on his face as he nodded and said, I understand. Do you have any other questions? Count Schultz thought for a moment and said, Your Grace, with all due respect, if you are willing to reveal the truth that you are still alive, we won't have to go through so much trouble. The Duke of St. Hilda's eyes flashed and he shook his head coldly. I am seriously injured right now. It is not suitable for me to show my face. Otherwise, I will be hunted down by my enemies. Just do as I say. As long as you do this well, I will not go back on my promise to you. Yes. Count Schultz lowered his head obediently. When he raised his head again, he discovered that the Duke of St. Hilda had already disappeared. Chapter 331. After returning to his room, Colin washed up and prepared to go to bed. However, he couldn't fall asleep as he tossed and turned in his bed. His mind kept replaying the secret that Count Schultz had just revealed to him. Suddenly, Colin realized a problem. When Queen Medela claimed that she was Vera's mother, she had also revealed another secret. She had poisoned Marquis Adams to death. If Queen Medela wasn't Vera's biological mother, why would she poison Adams when Duke St. Hilda went back on his word and didn't give Vera the title of Marquis of the Northern Territory? Well, if this was also a lie that Queen Medela had told him, then what about the will that the Duke of St. Hilda had left behind? Before Count Almond died, he had said that someone had forced the Duke of St. Hilda to write this will. And that person was most likely Queen Medela. Moreover, when they were in Imperial Dragon City, Queen Medela had indeed been helping Vera to inherit the position of the Dukes of the North. If it wasn't because Vera was her daughter, then what was the reason? Queen Medela's words might be false, but what she had done had always been true. Based on this, Colin could not deny the special care that she had given to Vera. And Count Schultz, on the contrary, Count Schultz seemed to have only made a verbal claim, but there was no proof in his actions. However, Colin also felt that Count Schultz was unlikely to lie. After all, if she was not Vera's biological mother, then as an outsider, it was unlikely that she would know who Vera's biological father was. Moreover, her lie would be immediately exposed by Marquis Garcia. After all, she had already prepared to announce her relationship with Vera to the public. Wait a minute. Colin immediately sat up straight in bed. Count Schultz wanted to announce his relationship with Vera to the public. Colin suddenly realized that once Count Schultz acknowledged Vera in public, and confirmed their relationship as mother and daughter, then even if she was lying, Marquis Garcia would not dare to refute her publicly. This was because the relationship between Queen Medela and Vera could not be exposed to the public. The Empire of Light would never accept a queen who was incestuous with her brother. The reputation of the House of St. Hilda would also suffer a great blow because of this. Therefore, even if Count Schultz was lying, he had nothing to fear. However, there was a problem with this assumption. How did Count Schultz know that Marquis Garcia was Vera's biological father? Moreover, looking at her fearless appearance, she should also know that Vera's real birth mother was Empress Medela. Even Marquis Garcia did not tell Colin this secret. So, who was lying? Queen Medela or was it Count Schultz? This question lingered in Colin's mind, and he could no longer sleep peacefully. Since he could not sleep, Colin simply got out of bed. Colin put on a coat and walked out of the room. It was late at night, and Swan Castle was very quiet. Only the faint sound of an owl could be heard. Colin walked along the dim corridor, thinking about whether he should bring Vera to the city tomorrow. If Count Schultz was lying, then once Vera entered the city and the two of them acknowledged each other in public, then even if Count Schultz was not Vera's biological mother, he would still have to be her mother. This was because Marquis Garcia would not dare to refute in public, and as for Empress Medela, she would definitely not dare to admit it. As he thought about this, Colin suddenly felt that he should not bring Vera into the city. At the very least, he should ask Marquis Garcia first. If Count Schultz was really Vera's biological mother, then Colin could bring her to Winter City to meet Vera. There was no need to rush. After making up his mind, Colin's mood was much more relaxed. Just as he was about to return to his room to rest, he smelled the faint smell of blood again. Colin narrowed his eyes. This was because he realized that the smell of blood was exactly the same as the one he had smelled in the confessional of the Glory Church in Swan City not long ago. Following the smell, Colin quickened his pace. Not long after, he found that he had returned to the open balcony where he had talked to Count Schultz earlier. The cold moonlight shone on Colin's face, reflecting his uncertain expression. Colin looked at the dark lake outside the balcony, which looked like the mouth of an abyss, and a sneer appeared on his lips. Count Schultz, it seems that you are not a good person after all. Early the next morning, when the sky was just beginning to brighten, several maids who were fetching water from the lake saw Colin and his entourage riding back to the camp. Good morning, Lord Viscounts. Good morning, is the Duke still asleep? Not yet. Colin nodded at the maids before he entered the camp and went straight to Vera's tent. As expected, the new Duke of the Northern Region was still sleeping soundly. Colin bent down and gently kissed her fair and smooth forehead. Vera's long eyelashes fluttered a few times before she opened her eyes in a daze. When she saw that it was Colin, she snorted a few times before she hugged his arm and used it as a pillow. Colin, why are you back so early? Colin stretched out his hand and ran his fingers through Vera's soft hair before he said gently, I am here to say goodbye to you. I have to return to Swan City later. Vera sat up straight and wrapped her arms around Colin's neck before she asked, Have you found Bishop John yet? Not yet. I have also found some interesting things here that require further investigation. So, you should return to Winter City first. Okay. Vera was a little reluctant to part with Colin. She leaned forward and gave him a deep kiss. After a while, Colin took out a letter from his pocket and handed it to Vera. At the same time, he reminded her, when you return to Winter City, help me hand this letter to Marquis Garcia and ask him to reply to me immediately. Do you understand? When Vera saw the serious expression on Colin's face, she stopped being lazy and nodded seriously. I understand. Okay, then I will leave now. Remember to say goodbye to the two little guys for me. Okay, be careful. Outside Swan City, the honor guard of the Schultz family was once again in the most neat formation. They were ready to welcome the guests who were about to arrive. Count Schultz and Lucien stood at the front of the line hand in hand. Both of them had perfect smiles on their faces as they looked at the approaching group from the other side of the river. However, it was not long before the smile on Lucien's face froze. He squinted his eyes and said seriously, No. That's not the carriage of the Dukes of the North. There are too few people. What? Count Schultz looked at the screen and realized that something was wrong. Her heart sank. She kept thinking about what she had done wrong. Soon, Colin arrived at Swan City. He immediately dismounted from his horse and said sincerely, I am so sorry, Count Schultz. The Duke's carriage had already left. I was too late. Count Schultz took a deep breath and tried to suppress the anger and fear in his heart. He tried his best to put on a slightly disappointed look and said, It's okay. It seems that Swan City is destined to be unable to enjoy this glory. Colin carefully observed the expression on Count Schultz's face. Suddenly, he laughed and said, Count Schultz. You should go to Winter City and meet the Duke in person, Count Schultz. Of course. Count Schultz regained his composure. The elegant Countess appeared again. Colin turned to look at the expressionless Lucien and smiled. Sir Lucien, why don't we search Swan City again and see if we can find the whereabouts of Bishop John? Lucien smiled faintly. My pleasure. Chapter 332. Lucien, who was wearing a full set of silver armor, walked into Swan Castle with heavy footsteps. A squire took over Lucien's helmet and sword, and a pretty maid bowed to Lucien and presented him with a clean wet towel. Lucien wiped his face with the towel and asked, "Where is the lady?" The maid took over the wet towel and answered softly, "The Count is changing his clothes on the second floor." Lucien nodded and walked up the spiral stairs to the second floor. He pushed open a wooden door and saw that Countess Schultz had already changed into a pure black dress. Her beautiful hair was coiled into the most popular upper-class bun style, and a string of sparkling and translucent pearl necklaces hung around her creamy neck. Her delicate and three-dimensional facial features were lightly painted, making her look graceful and luxurious, and her beauty was unparalleled. "You're back." Countess Schultz smiled at her husband and helped him take off his armor. She asked, "What did you get today?" Lucien smiled and shrugged, "What can I find? I just accompanied Viscount Angley to walk around Swan Castle. However, I found that the Viscount's was not perfunctory. He was looking for the bishop's whereabouts very seriously." Countess Schultz smiled faintly and said disapprovingly, "He's looking for a needle in a haystack." "What can he find?" Lucien frowned and said, "I think he might have found something. Otherwise, he wouldn't be so focused all the time, as if he was really looking for clues." Countess Schultz's hands paused for a second, and her face became a bit serious. "Did he find something?" Lucien shook his head, "I don't know. However, since he didn't want Vera to come to Swan City to meet you, he must have some suspicions." Count Schultz frowned and said in confusion, "I can't figure out what went wrong that made him suspicious." Lucien said his guess while taking off his armor, "Maybe he already knows the identity of Vera's real mother?" "I don't think so." Count Schultz shook his head. "Since that person is so sure that Marquis Garcia would not stand up to refute me, it means that the identity of Vera's biological mother is extremely sensitive. It is unlikely that Viscount Angley would know about this secret." Lucien could not help but ask curiously, "Did that person say anything about Vera's real mother?" "No. He only said that Vera's real biological mother did not dare to acknowledge Vera at all." Lucien rubbed his chin as if he was trying to figure out who Vera's real mother was. Seeing this, Count Schultz reminded him, "All right, stop guessing. If you're worried that Viscount Angley has discovered something, you can test him during the banquet later." Lucien nodded and said, "Okay, I'll go wash up and change into clean clothes." Dong dong dong. At this moment, there was a sudden knock on the door. "Come in," Count Schultz said loudly, and then the butler pushed the door open and walked in. The butler first greeted the Count and his wife, and then reported, "My lord, Viscount Angley wants to visit Swan Castle." "Visit? I think he wants to search the castle," Lucien said with a cold face. Count Schultz's eyes also narrowed, but she soon returned to normal. She said to the butler, "Please ask Viscount Angley to wait for a while. I'll accompany him to visit Swan Castle." "Yes, my lady," the butler replied and closed the door again. Lucien's eyes flashed with a dangerous light, and he said coldly, "Did he really find something?" Count Schultz patted her husband's strong chest and comforted him. "If he really found something, he should pretend that he knows nothing, and then quietly leave Swan Castle to ask for help from Winter. He shouldn't have alerted us like this." Lucien nodded and felt that his wife was right. Then he restrained his aura. "Then what are you going to do?" "If he wants to visit, then I'll accompany him," Count Schultz said indifferently. Lucien understood his wife's meaning. He nodded and said, "Okay, you go accompany him. I'll go ask that guy to move his nest." "Okay." Count Schultz nodded, and then said in a warning tone, "You'd better be respectful in front of that guy." Do you really think he's the Duke of St. Hilda? Lucien sneered. Except for his appearance, his attitude, his tone, and some of his habits are completely different from the real Duke of St. Hilda. Although I don't know what's going on with his appearance, he can't fool those who really know the Duke of St. Hilda. Count Schultz said with a deep meaning, he has the face of a duke, and he has the strength of a duke. Why can't he be the Duke of St. Hilda? Strength? The look on Lucien's face became even more disdainful. With his current condition, I can chop his head off in an hourglass. Never underestimate the power of a saint knight, Lucien. Count Schultz's face became serious. Even though he's still injured, if you really dare to provoke him, you won't end well. Seeing that Lucien was still not convinced, Count Schultz's eyes became serious. You promised me, Lucien. Don't go back on your words. Of course I remember my promise. I just hope you won't forget yours, Lucien responded coldly. Count Schultz looked into his husband's eyes seriously and nodded. Of course I won't forget. That's good. But I still have to remind you, don't be fooled by the title of Duchess. It's just an empty promise. Count Schultz nodded solemnly and said, of course, I know what I'm doing. I won't completely trust that Duke of St. Hilda, who I don't know if he's real or not. That's good. Lucien put on his half-taken armor again and said, you go deal with Viscount Angli first. I'll take care of the Duke of St. Hilda. Count Schultz nodded and walked out of the room. Swan Castle was a Gothic-style building with a large number of pointed roof designs. It was tall, thin, and thick. The outer walls were painted white, which complemented the green Swan Lake. It had a strong visual impact and was unforgettable. The castle was more than 30 meters high, with 7 floors and more than 200 rooms. It would take Lucien more than half a day to visit them one by one. Under the guidance of Count Schultz, Colin only skimmed through the castle. Viscount Angli, this is the main castle. There are 2 side castles behind, as well as warehouses, stables, farms, and so on. Do you want to continue? Standing in the main hall of Swan Castle, Colin glanced around, as if he was admiring the decorations and decorations around. Seeing Count Schultz pointing at the door, Lucien did not immediately go forward. Instead, he stamped his feet and asked with a smile, my lord, is there no basement under the main castle? Of course there is. At this time, Lucien walked in. He must have just taken a shower and changed into a black suit. He smiled at Colin. There's a wine cellar and a storage room. Would you like to have a look, my lord Viscounts? Colin nodded his head and said, of course. Chapter 333. Following the mottled stone steps, Colin followed Count Schultz to the basement of Swan Castle. 2 attendants led the way in front and lit up the braziers embedded in the stone wall in advance. The flames lit up the dark and gloomy corridor. Due to the lack of ventilation, the air in the basement was extremely turbid. The smell of wine, grass, and a faint smell of rot mixed together, making one feel suffocated. Soon, they reached the end of the corridor and arrived at a spacious underground space. Count Schultz pointed at the wooden doors in front of him and asked, Viscount Angli, there are 7 rooms here. Which one do you want to see first? Colin glanced around the wooden doors and pointed at the one in the middle casually. Is this the wine cellar? Yes. Count Schultz smiled gently. Also, it contains the most precious wine of Swan Castle. Then I would like to see it. Count Schultz nodded at the attendant calmly and signaled for him to open the door. With a slightly ear-piercing creak, the wooden door slowly opened, and a strong smell of wine wafted out. Colin's eyes lit up. He seemed to be attracted by the smell of wine and immediately strode in. Count Schultz also followed him in. At the same time, he pointed at the rows of wine shelves in the room and introduced them. Viscount Angli, these are the best wines from the Winst Highlands. The deeper you go, the older they are. If you like, you can pick one for the banquet later. I don't know much about wine. Why don't you pick one for me? As Colin walked in, he looked around casually, as if he was really attracted by the wine in the room. But in fact, he had already smelled the familiar faint smell of blood. Bishop John's disappearance was indeed related to the Schultz family. Also, the Schultz family and the Morrison family were probably related. He just didn't know why they kidnapped Bishop John. Viscount Angley, if I were you, I would pick that row of wine. Count Schultz pointed at the wine shelf in the middle of the room and said with a smile. Colin asked curiously, why? First of all, grape wine isn't suitable for immediate consumption when it's just produced. It's best to store it for 4 to 5 years to get rid of its sourness. The wine in this row is the work of the Winst Manor from 4 years ago. Furthermore, the weather that year was warm and the precipitation was abundant. The quality of the grapes was very good, and I believe that you will be able to taste the most wonderful flavor. After listening to Count Schultz's explanation, Colin nodded, not fully understanding. He strode forward, ready to pick a random one and leave. Anyway, he had already achieved the goal of this trip. He had confirmed that the Schultz family was indeed scheming as he had guessed. However, just as he picked a bottle of wine and was about to leave, he caught sight of the other side of the wine rack from the corner of his eye. His entire body froze in that instant. Viscount Angley, have you made your choice? Count Schultz looked at the motionless Colin and asked in confusion. However, Colin was still staring at the wine rack in a daze, as if he did not hear Count Schultz's question. Count Schultz exchanged a glance with Lucien, who was standing next to him. Their eyes were full of confusion, but they still strode forward. Then, both of them were stunned. This was because a corpse was lying abruptly behind the row of wine racks. The dead body seemed to have been drained of blood. The face was pale and haggard, but they could still tell that it was Bishop John, who had been missing for many days. Count Schultz's eyes were wide open. He immediately looked at Lucien, as if he was questioning him, "What the hell did you do?" Lucien's eyebrows were tightly knitted, and his eyes were full of confusion and grievance. He really wanted to tell his wife that he had already reminded that guy to move. However, he did not know that the guy had left out the most important thing. No. It was not a mistake. He did it on purpose. Count Schultz felt a chill running down his spine. He finally understood the sinister intention of the Duke of St. Hilda. Since Vera did not enter the city, Duke of St. Hilda must have realized that his original plan had been seen through. Therefore, he immediately changed his plan and betrayed Count Schultz without any hesitation. Colin had already found the dead body. What should he do now? Count Schultz's mind was in a mess. Countless ideas popped up in his mind, but none of them were reliable. Colin was also dumbfounded at this moment. He did not expect that they would really find Bishop John's dead body in the basement of Swan Castle. When he proposed to visit Swan Castle earlier, he did not intend to find Bishop John at all. He only wanted to confirm whether the Schultz family had anything to do with the disappearance of Bishop John. The only way to confirm this was through the special smell of blood. However, he did not expect that things would turn out like this. He had given the Schultz family so much time to clean up the scene, but they were really stupid enough to leave Bishop John's dead body in the basement. Normally, Colin should be happy that the case of Bishop John's disappearance was solved. However, at this moment, he was not happy at all. Colin was completely locked down by the strong pressure coming from behind him. He knew that the young man was going to kill him. As his mind raced, Colin slowly turned around. He revealed a stiff smile and said, "I'm sorry. Count, I did not expect that the murderer of Bishop John would be so cunning and sinister." Count Schultz looked at Colin with a poker face and asked, "Oh? Why do you say that?" "Because he left Bishop John's dead body in the basement of Swan Castle. It's obvious that he wanted to frame the Schultz family. Don't you think he's sinister?" Count Schultz was a bit surprised, but he immediately understood what Colin meant. At this time, Count Schultz was also in a dilemma. He did not know how to deal with Colin. The fact that Bishop John's dead body was in the basement of Swan Castle made it very difficult for the Schultz family to explain to the church. Count Schultz did think of killing Colin, who was the witness, to cover up the case. However, she was also worried that doing so would infuriate the House of St. Hilda. The solution proposed by Colin seemed to work, but she still could not make up her mind. Count Schultz did not know whether such an excuse would work in front of the church, and whether the damn Duke of St. Hilda had any other tricks up his sleeve. Colin looked at Count Schultz, who was silent and whose facial expression was changing constantly, and reminded her carefully, "Count, don't make the wrong decision, and don't fall into the trap of the real murderer." Count Schultz bit her red lips and said in a low voice, "Viscount Angley, Bishop John's death has nothing to do with the Schultz family." "I believe you." Colin immediately said, "If you knew that Bishop John died here, you wouldn't have taken the initiative to bring me here to choose the wine." Count Schultz nodded and let out a long breath. Then she turned around and looked at Lucien, as if she was asking for his opinion. Lucien did not relax. The horrible power coming out of his body was like a big net, covering Colin in it. It seemed that if anything went wrong, a thunderous strike would fall on his head. Seeing this, Colin's heart sank. When he was about to explain again, a servant's voice came from outside the cellar. "My lord, the city defense sent a message saying that the Archbishop of the Northern Frontier, Lady Ajani, has just arrived in Swan City." "Ajani?" The atmosphere in the cellar changed again. Chapter 334. In the dark basement, the atmosphere was heavy. Count Schultz had left in a hurry, presumably to welcome the arrival of Archbishop Ajani. So only Colin and Lucien were left here, facing each other. "Mr. Lucien, are you going to kill me?" Colin suddenly asked with a smile. Lucien did not answer. He just stared at Colin with his sharp eyes. Facing the terrifying pressure of a sixth-rank warrior, Colin was like a small boat in a stormy sea, which could capsize at any time. "You don't dare to kill me," Colin said with a smile. "I'm not a nobody. I'm the Viscounts of the Empire, the guardian of the Northern Frontier, and the husband of the Duke of St. Hilda. Hee, can your Schultz family bear the consequences of killing me?" Lucien still did not say anything, but Colin caught a trace of doubt in his eyes. Colin knew what was going on. He tried to persuade Lucien again, "I believe the Schultz family has its own difficulties. Why don't you tell me the truth? You don't have to worry that I'll blame the Schultz family for this. You have to believe that I've always been very tolerant of the lords of the Northern Frontier. Think about the Oman family and the Dawson family. They've made huge mistakes before, but they're still fine now." Lucien was still unmoved. Colin shrugged and said helplessly, "You don't dare to kill me, but you don't want to let me go either. Mr. Lucien, you're not going to watch me like this for the rest of my life, are you?" "Why not?" Lucien finally answered. Colin smiled faintly and joked, "Okay, then you can accompany me in this dark basement for the rest of your life. With so much good wine here, I think the rest of my life won't be too boring." Lucien's face darkened, as if he had finally made up his mind. He said fiercely, "I'm sorry, Viscount Angley. You'll have to suffer for a while." Following his words, Colin immediately felt that the atmosphere in the cellar had changed. If it was a storm before, now it was a complete mess. "Wait! Lucien!" Boom! Before Colin could finish speaking, he saw the shadow of a fist rapidly enlarging in front of him. An irresistible force, accompanied by a violent whistling sound, fiercely attacked his chest. The surrounding air also became stagnant. Colin felt as though he was trapped in a huge net. Every movement required a great deal of effort. Unable to dodge, he could only use his hands to protect his chest. Rumble! Bursting holy light and surging combat aura suddenly exploded between the two of them. Circles of ripples spread out, shaking the entire wine cellar. All of the wine exploded in an instant, and the overflowing wine aroma filled the small space. Crack! Amidst the heart-palpitating sound of bones breaking, Colin only felt a sharp pain coming from his hands. He couldn't help but let out a blood-curdling scream. His entire body was violently sent flying by the shockwave, crashing into the wall on the side. Lucien immediately caught up with Colin. Gathering the horrifying power in both of his fists, he once again bombarded Colin's legs. After another series of bone-cracking sounds, Colin completely collapsed on the ground, sweating profusely and gasping for breath. However, he didn't look too panicked. Instead, he twitched the corner of his mouth, revealing a mocking smile, and said with difficulty, "Hee. If you really have the guts. Just kill me right now. Or I'll make you wish you were dead." Looking at Colin's broken limbs, Lucien seemed to finally be relieved. He said lightly, "Lord Viscounts, please be patient and stay here for a while. When the Schultz family finds out the real culprit behind Bishop John's murder, we'll come and apologize to you." After saying this, Lucien no longer cared about Colin, turned around, and strode away. Out of the cellar, Lucien glanced at the 2 guards outside the door and said, "Guard this place well. Except for the Count and me, don't let anyone come close." "Yes." The 2 guards hurriedly replied. They also heard the noise in the cellar just now. They were not stupid and had already guessed some things, but they didn't dare to ask more questions. After Lucien's figure disappeared at the end of the stone steps, the cellar returned to silence. But not long after, a series of cracking sounds came from the cellar, as if the wine bottles were broken, followed by a horrifying scream. Then, the cellar returned to silence. The 2 guards looked at each other and saw the confusion in each other's eyes. "What's going on?" One of them couldn't help but ask in a low voice. "I don't know." The other one shook his head, and a trace of worry appeared on his face. "That person. Nothing happened to him, right?" Of course, they knew who the person inside was, and they also knew that the person was of noble status. "If anything happened, should I go in and take a look?" "Yes, go ahead. I'll guard the door for you." One of the guards then pushed the door open and entered the cellar. The cellar was in a mess. Collapsed wine shelves and broken wine bottles were everywhere, and the air was filled with the strong smell of wine. And at the innermost corner of the cellar, Viscount Angley was lying on the ground, motionless. "Sir Viscounts?" The guard called out a few times, but he didn't get any response. He carefully walked forward and called out a few more times, but there was still no response from Colin. The guard was a little flustered. He bent down and patted Colin's shoulder. "Viscounts, swish." In an instant, Colin, who had been motionless, suddenly raised his head and opened his bloody mouth. His ferocious fangs shone with a cold light under the dim candlelight. "Ah!" The guard let out a short cry, and then he found that all his strength and blood were rapidly flowing out of his body through the arm that was bitten by Angley. He opened his mouth wide and wanted to shout for help, but he found that he could only make a low, huff, huff sound. As the blood was sucked in, Colin's body rapidly swelled. His broken bones were also healing at an unnatural speed. A pair of large bat wings extended from his back, instantly filling up the small space in the cellar. Seeing that his companion didn't respond, the guard outside carefully opened the door to the cellar. And then, he saw a scene that he would never forget. In the dining hall on the 3rd floor of Swan Castle, a young maid walked in with light steps, serving plate after plate of delicacies on the long table. Count Schultz had an elegant smile on his face as he said politely, "Your Excellency, it must have been hard for you to come all the way to Swan City. Please have a taste of the delicacies that the Schultz family has prepared for you." Akani smiled and thanked the Count. Her beautiful eyes glanced around the hall, and she asked curiously, "Count Schultz, I met Mr. Schultz on my way back from Dragon City." "Count, I met Duke St. Hilda on the way here. She told me that Viscount Angeli stayed in Swan City to help with the investigation of Bishop John's disappearance." Why didn't I see him? Count Schultz's expression did not change. He smiled and said, Your Excellency, it's a pity that the Viscounts just left this afternoon. Really? That's a pity. Akane nodded, as if she believed the Count. Then what about your husband? He's not in Swan Castle either. Akane asked again. When Count Schultz was thinking about how to explain, he saw a figure walking into the dining hall from the corner of his eye. He immediately smiled and said, Lucien, what took you so long? The Archbishop just asked about you. Lucien walked into the dining hall and bowed to Akane. He explained with a smile, I'm sorry, Your Excellency. Just now, a thief sneaked into the basement and wanted to steal some wine. I went to deal with him. That's why I'm late. Akane stood up and bowed back. She smiled and said, A thief dares to steal from Swan Castle? How bold. I know, right? Maybe it's because the wine in Swan Castle's cellar is too famous that it attracted greedy eyes. Count Schultz smiled and said. As they talked and laughed, the atmosphere of the banquet gradually became more lively. However, not long after, the butler hurried in and whispered something in Lucien's ear. Then, Lucien's face changed. What's wrong? Akane asked curiously. Lucien smiled and pretended to be calm. He said, Nothing. I just didn't expect that the thief who stole the wine had an accomplice who saved him. Then he wiped his mouth with a napkin and stood up. I'm really sorry, Your Excellency. I have to go catch the thief who escaped. I'm afraid I won't be able to enjoy the rest of the dinner with you. Akane was confused. Mr. Lucien, it's just a thief. Do you really need to go catch him yourself? That thief has some skills, and the family guards have disappointed me too much. So, I still have to chase after him personally. I've made a fool of myself. Akane smiled and waved her hand, indicating that Count Schultz could do as he pleased. Lucien then winked at Count Schultz and strode out of the dining hall. Count Schultz was very nervous, but on the surface, he forced himself to be calm. He tried to say in a relaxed tone, Your Excellency, don't worry about Lucien. Your Grace, you don't have to worry about Lucien. Let's enjoy the banquet. Akane took a deep look at the Countess beside her and smiled. Okay. Chapter 335. When Lucien returned to the basement, the first thing he saw was a pile of dead bodies. The bodies of the guards of the Schultz family. As for Colin and Bishop John, their corpses had already disappeared. Lucien tried his best to suppress his anger and asked the butler, what happened? The butler explained carefully, My lord, I was not there, but the guard who came to report to me said that not long after you left, there was a scream in the basement. Then the guards in the hall went into the basement to check, and one of them was sent to report to me. I came here as soon as I received the report, but I found that the 30 guards who went into the basement were all killed, and Viscount Angley was nowhere to be found. However, I guess that they haven't escaped from Swan Castle yet. Lucien's eyes lit up, and he quickly asked, Oh? Why? Because the guards did not find anyone going in or out of the castle. So, unless they can fly, they must still be in the castle. Okay. Send people to search the whole castle. Yes, my lord. When the first ray of the morning sun shone on the castle, Lucien was still standing at the entrance of the basement, in the same posture as last night. Lucien heard the familiar footsteps behind him. He turned around and saw Count Schultz walking towards him with a cup of coffee. Do you want to take a rest? Count Schultz handed the coffee to his husband and asked. No, thanks. Lucien shook his head and drank the coffee in one gulp. Although he did not sleep last night, it did not seem to affect him much. He was still in high spirits. However, the worry in his eyes did not disappear. Seeing this, Count Schultz felt even more depressed. He asked, Still nothing? Lucien shook his head. When he was about to say something, the captain of the guards, Knight Brett, hurried over. Knight Brett was refreshed and asked, "How is it? Did you find anything?" Knight Brett saluted first and then reported, "My lord, Mr. Lucien, the guards have finished searching the castle, but they still did not find Viscount Angley. However, we found some blood stains on the wall on the east side of the castle." Count Schultz asked anxiously, "So, they escaped from Swan Castle from there?" "That should be the case." Lucien frowned and asked in an unfriendly tone, "Then tell me, how did they climb over the wall without alerting the patrolling guards? Furthermore, you're carrying a cripple with broken limbs?" Knight Brett was stunned. He lowered his head and said, "I don't know." Lucien snorted and ordered, "Inform the city guards immediately to close all the gates of the castle. No one is allowed in or out. You will personally lead a team of guards and follow me to search the city." "Sir, my lord," said Knight Brett to be prepared. Count Schultz's brow furrowed. "Who saved Viscount Angeli? Is it the Duke of St? Lucien's face was gloomy as he said coldly, "No matter who it is, I will bring them back." The night of the castle to the castle to the castle castle to the castle. The hazy moonlight shone through the window and filled the room. Countess Schultz had just finished bathing. Her hair was still slightly damp. She was wearing white silk pajamas and sitting in front of the dressing table. Looking at herself in the mirror, the countess suddenly sighed. Her beautiful face was filled with unconcealable worry. It had been 3 days since Colin escaped from the basement. Over the past 3 days, Lucien had personally led a team to turn Swan City upside down, but they still could not find Colin's whereabouts. This morning, Lucien was certain that Colin had escaped from Swan City, so he led 3,000 men to chase after him. In the evening, a messenger came back with good news. Lucien had found traces of Colin, and it would not be long before they were captured. Logically speaking, such good news should have made Count Schultz feel at ease. However, after receiving this news, the Countess had an ominous premonition. After thinking in front of the mirror for a long time, Countess Schultz shouted to the door, "Mary?" She waited for a while, but there was no response from the maid who was supposed to be guarding the door. Countess Schultz frowned and was about to stand up to check, but at this time, a gust of wind suddenly rushed in through the open window. Whoosh, the candle was blown out, and the whole room was shrouded in darkness. Countess Schultz's heart skipped a beat. When she was about to shout, she found that the back of her neck was tightly gripped by a big hand. "Don't make a sound, Countess." Hearing the familiar voice behind her, Countess Schultz's heart almost jumped out of her throat. She tried to keep calm and forced a smile. "Viscount Angley, where have you been? We've been worried about you for a long time." Colin turned around and stood in front of Countess Schultz. Under the soft moonlight, he looked at the beautiful Countess in front of him from head to toe. Their posture was quite ambiguous, as if they were lovers hugging each other under the moonlight. Of course, if Colin's big hand was not gripping the back of Countess Schultz's neck tightly, "Countess Schultz, I can't accept your husband's hospitality, so I chose to stay away from him for now. Viscount Angley, I apologize for what Lucien did to you before. But please believe me, the Schultz family means you and the House of St. Hilda no harm. If you're still angry, I can make it up to you." Countess Schultz's tone became ambiguous, and her body slowly moved closer to Colin. Facing the seduction of this mature and beautiful countess, Colin was not moved at all. He even increased the strength of his hand, as if he was going to crush Countess Schultz's delicate and slender neck. "Ah!" Countess Schultz groaned in pain, and she did not dare to do it again. She only looked at Colin with her big, watery eyes as if she had been wronged. The touch of tenderness and charm in her eyes seemed to be able to melt steel. Unfortunately, it was unable to move Colin. He only heard him coldly say, instead, he said coldly, "Countess Schultz, please tell me the truth. Viscount Angley, I admit that Lucien did go too far, but he was just worried that you might misunderstand the Schultz family." "Misunderstand?" Colin sneered and interrupted Countess Schultz's sophistry. Don't tell me that you had nothing to do with Bishop John's death, and don't tell me that you didn't try to trick Vera into coming to the city. Also, do you really think that I don't know who Vera's real mother is? Countess Schultz's heart skipped a beat. She finally understood why she was exposed. She wanted nothing more than to tear that damned Duke St. Hilda to shreds. Not only did that impostor give her a lousy idea, he even pushed the Schultz family into a fire pit when he saw that things were going south. Perhaps, from the very beginning, this Duke of St. Hilda wanted the Schultz family to become enemies with the House of St. Hilda. Countess Schultz found herself in a dilemma. It was impossible for her to lie. After all, Colin had seen through her trick from the very beginning. However, she did not dare to tell the truth. The Schultz family could not bear the consequences of telling the truth. She had pretended to be the mother of the Dukes of the North and helped to murder Bishop John. Countess Schultz did not believe that Colin, or the House of St. Hilda, would let her go. Looking at the struggling Countess Schultz, Colin opened his mouth again. Countess Schultz, as I said before, I am a merciful person. As long as you are willing to tell the truth, I will forgive all your sins. So, I'll give you one more chance. If you dare to lie again, then don't blame me for being ruthless. Countess Schultz's expression changed rapidly. After a long time, she sighed and said, Viscount Angley, please believe me. Bishop John's death has nothing to do with the Schultz family. You must not be fooled by such a clumsy method. Also, I am really Vera's biological mother. I even dared to confront Marquis Garcia face to face. Sigh. Colin let out a long sigh. It seemed that he had completely lost his trust in the Countess. He said coldly, Ask for forgiveness for the sins you have committed. After saying that, he stabbed a dagger into Countess Schultz's heart. Woo! Before Countess Schultz could cry out in pain, Colin covered her throat. Her eyes were filled with disbelief. Obviously, she did not expect that Colin would actually dare to kill her. After all, she was the Countess of the Northern Frontier. She was also the wife of a Sixth-Order warrior. Was Colin not afraid of revenge? After the intense pain, Countess Schultz felt a surge of powerlessness. She could only feel the light in front of her fading little by little. She opened her mouth as if she wanted to leave something behind for the world, but no sound came out. Before she completely lost consciousness, Countess Schultz felt as if her neck had been bitten. Chapter 336. Countess Schultz felt like she had just had a long dream. In her dream, she saw the God of Light. The God of Light touched her forehead gently, as if he had said something. However, Countess Schultz found that she could not hear the God of Light clearly. It was as if something had cut off the connection between her and the God of Light, preventing them from communicating. Opening her eyes, Countess Schultz found that she was still in her bedroom in Swan Castle. With the help of the dim moonlight shining through the window, she could clearly see Colin sitting in a chair in front of her, calmly looking at her. Countess Schultz felt that she should have felt fear, but in fact, Colin seemed to be shrouded in a layer of holy light at this moment. In a trance, the image of the God of Light that she had seen in her dream overlapped with the face of the young viscounts in front of her. This discovery made Countess Schultz inexplicably horrified, but a deep reverence and admiration rooted in the depths of her blood uncontrollably welled up in her heart, making Countess Schultz only want to worship Colin. What happened to me? Countess Schultz's eyes were hazy, and she asked in a dreamy tone. Colin sat upright on the chair, looking down at Countess Schultz who had collapsed on the ground, and said indifferently, You just died. You've just died, but I've forgiven you, so I've granted you rebirth. Rebirth? Countess Schultz's face was filled with disbelief, but when she lowered her head, she saw the dagger that was still inserted in her heart. Pull it out yourself. Colin's indifferent voice sounded again. Countess Schultz's hands trembled as she grasped the handle of the dagger. Her heart was filled with fear, but she did not hesitate to follow Colin's orders. Whoosh! The dagger was pulled out. Countess Schultz cried out in pain, but she did not see the blood splattering everywhere as she had expected. Moreover, she even felt that this wound that should have been fatal did not exist at all. From now on, you will be bathed in the grace of the God of Light, and you will not die so easily. Colin opened his mouth again and tried to trick him. Perhaps even Pope Gregory himself might not be able to do a better job than him. The fear on Countess Schultz's face was gradually replaced by devotion. She prostrated herself on the ground and said, "Praise the Lord." Raising his head again, Count Schultz looked at Colin with eyes full of reverence. "Are you God's chosen one?" he asked. Colin nodded and said, "Yes, but you should keep my identity to yourself. You are not allowed to tell anyone else." "I understand." Count Schultz nodded. After experiencing the miracle that happened to him, Count Schultz had unreserved trust in Colin. Colin carefully observed every tiny change of Count Schultz. He wanted to see if transforming into a blood descendant could really turn an enemy into a friend. After all, the blood descendants had self-awareness. That was why Colin had been very careful to avoid converting them into enemies. He was worried that the blood descendants would show respect on the surface but betray him behind his back. Now, it seemed like Count Schultz had been brainwashed. He no longer had any hostility towards Colin. However, Colin could not make a conclusion yet. He still needed to verify it further. "Tell me, what's going on with Bishop John? Who asked you to pretend to be Vera's biological mother?" Faced with the same question again, Count Schultz decisively did not quibble anymore. He said honestly, "It all started 10 days ago. At that time, a man who looked exactly like the previous Duke of St. Hilda suddenly came to me." "The Duke of St. Hilda?" Colin's heart skipped a beat. He could not help but exclaim in surprise. Yes. Although he looked exactly like the previous Duke, there was a big difference in his tone and demeanor. Of course, I could tell. It was only because this man also had the strength of a paladin that I did not dare to resist. I could only follow his orders. This man must have been injured, so he asked us to help him catch Bishop John and heal him. Also, he knew a lot of secrets about the House of St. Hilda, including Vera's background. That was why he asked me to pretend to be Vera's biological mother. He said that there was no need to worry about me being exposed, because Vera's real mother did not even dare to acknowledge her as her daughter. Hearing Count Schultz's story, Colin frowned and asked, "What happened after that? How did Bishop John's body end up in the basement of Swan Castle?" When we saw John's body, Lucien and I were also quite shocked. I asked Lucien to warn that man, and he also knew that you were going to search the whole castle. I thought that he would hide somewhere else for the time being, but who would have thought that he would betray you all? Colin immediately understood. Count Schultz nodded, yes. I think he saw that the Duke did not enter Swan City, and he felt that the Schultz family had lost its value. So he decided to provoke the conflict between us and the House of St. Hilda. Colin thought for a while and asked again, "Do you have any contact with the Morrison family?" The Morrison family? Count Schultz was a bit surprised that Colin would suddenly mention this family. He paused for a second and then shook his head. "We've never been close to the Morrison family, and we haven't had any contact with them recently." Colin was very cautious about Count Schultz's frankness. He could not check the consciousness of his blood kin, so he did not know whether she was lying or not. However, judging from what Count Schultz said earlier, Colin was inclined to believe that she was telling the truth. After all, if she wanted to lie, she would not have made up a story about the Duke of St. Hilda coming back from the dead. It was too unbelievable. If she was telling the truth, then what was going on with this Duke of St. Hilda? Could it be that the Morrison family had really resurrected the Duke of St. Hilda? Colin could not help but think of the strange blood pool under the clock tower of Phoenix Butterfly Castle. But then, he remembered that Count Schultz had said that this Duke of St. Hilda's demeanor, tone, habits, and so on were different from the real Duke. So, perhaps he had not come back from the dead, but came back from the dead in someone else's body. At this moment, Colin suddenly remembered Prince Lexi's reminder that Mr. Chi was not dead. Thinking of this, those isolated doubts seemed to be strung together by a string. Although this conjecture was too unbelievable, it seemed to be the most reasonable explanation. Mr. Chi had used the corpse of the Duke of St. Hilda to come back to life. Colin suddenly felt a bone-piercing chill. That terrifying person who had plunged the northern frontier into misery and suffering was actually still hiding in some corner, and could come out at any time to stir up another bloody storm. Perhaps, the Schultz family was the result of the other party's small experiment. Colin narrowed his eyes and forced himself to calm down. He knew that Mr. Chi was not invulnerable. At least, the other party only dared to hide in the shadows now, even if he had already taken over the body of a holy knight. That's right. Although he had successfully come back from the dead in someone else's body, the Duke of St. Hilda had suffered heavy injuries before his death. No wonder he wanted to kidnap Bishop John. He probably wanted Bishop John to treat his injuries. Colin immediately became alert. He had to inform the church of this matter. If Mr. Chi wanted to recover from his injuries, he would definitely kidnap more high-ranking priests of the church. In addition, he also thought of Prince Lexi. Wasn't this person tracking Mr. Chi all over the world? If he revealed this information to him, presumably this holy knight of the San Lorenzo family would be willing to help the northern frontier get rid of this evil. Thinking of this, Colin finally let out a sigh of relief. His gaze once again returned to Count Schultz. The Countess, who had been preparing to sleep, was now wearing a simple corset dress. She did not have any jewelry on her, but the dress was well tailored, vividly outlining her exquisite curves. The semicircular neckline revealed her delicate collarbone and snow-white skin. Coupled with her current submissive posture, it accentuated her mature, beautiful, and seductive charm. Colin forcibly retracted his gaze, suppressing the restlessness in his heart. Colin still needed to give this blood descendant, who had been transformed from an enemy, a final test. He really wanted to know if this blood descendant would betray him. Count Schultz, next, I need you to do this. Chapter 337. The sun was setting in the west, and the sky was getting dark. The guards of the Schultz family had set up a temporary camp on a small hill. They had left Swan City for 4 days, and in these 4 days, the area within a radius of a few hundred miles around Swan City had been thoroughly searched, but there was still nothing to be found. Lucien's patience seemed to be running out, and his temper was getting worse. Seeing this, the guards all avoided this lord, and even their footsteps were much lighter, afraid that they would get into trouble and become the target of his anger. Bonfires rose in the camp, and the orange tongues of the flames licked at the mutton on the iron rack, but they only tasted the hot oil dripping down. Lucien sat in front of the bonfire expressionlessly, and took a golden roasted leg of mutton. Ignoring the heat, he began to bite into it. The retainer hurriedly and carefully handed over the wine flask, and then retreated. After a few steps, the faint sound of horse hooves could be heard from the entrance of the camp, and then a messenger hurried over. Lucien frowned at the man's attire, and asked, "You're from Swan City?" The messenger hurriedly stepped forward and bowed, saying, "Yes, my lord. The Count has sent me to deliver a letter to you." As he spoke, he passed the letter to Lucien. Lucien opened it and saw that it was indeed a letter from Count Schultz himself. After quickly skimming through it, he stood up in surprise, his face filled with undisguised ecstasy. Seeing this, the retainer tactfully asked, "My lord, is there any good news?" "We've found him, and he's actually hiding in Swan Castle." "Ha, my initial guess was right, I was almost fooled," Lucien said excitedly. "Congratulations, my lord. Pass down my orders, rest for the night, and return to Swan City tomorrow." "Yes, my lord." Swan Castle. Archbishop Ajani was led into a guest hall by a maid. However, she did not see Count Schultz, who had invited her here. Instead, she saw someone else. Viscount Angley. Ajani looked at Colin in surprise. Didn't you already leave Swan City? Colin smiled bitterly and said, "Sigh, someone doesn't want me to leave just like that." Akani pointed at the wheelchair under Colin and asked, "Are you injured?" Colin pretended to sigh and nodded his head. Then, he pointed at a corner of the living room with his chin and said, "I'm quite lucky." What happened to Cardinal John was truly regrettable. Only then did Ajani notice that there was a coffin in the living room. She seemed to have realized something and walked over with a grave expression. Then, she saw Bishop John lying inside the coffin. Who did this? Ajani's tone turned cold. Lucien. Lucien? Ashani cried out in surprise. In addition to anger, there was also a trace of fear that could not be concealed. That's right. Colin nodded and said solemnly, "Lucien colluded with outsiders and killed Cardinal John. After I discovered the clues, I was wounded and imprisoned in the basement. Fortunately, Count Schultz found out in time and rescued me." Ajani's eyes flashed. She asked doubtfully, "So, Count Schultz betrayed her husband and saved you?" As a devout believer of light, an upright knight of the northern region, and an honorable count of the empire, she has chosen to abandon the darkness and embrace the light. Is there a problem with that? Colin asked with a straight face. Of course not. Ajani suppressed her doubts and asked, "Then, what about Count Schultz? Can I see her?" "She's right next door, waiting for Lucien's return." Ajani's expression changed. She asked somewhat nervously, "What does she want?" Of course, she wants to question her husband why he betrayed his faith and glory. Ajani looked at Colin's righteous face and her heart was filled with doubt. After a while, she said in a low voice, "Lucien is a rank 6 warrior." If he's angered, Colin snorted and interrupted her, "Your Excellency, are you afraid of the tyrannical power of a rank 6 warrior?" Ajani took a deep breath and regained her composure. She said, "Of course not. Under the glory of our Lord, no evil can escape from the judgment." That's good. Colin looked at the Archbishop in front of him with a smile. Count Schultz will expose Lucien's crime later and draw a clear line between them. The reason why I invited you here is that I hope you can be a witness. Okay. Seeing Colin's calm face, Ajani seemed to have realized something, so she stopped worrying. After thinking for a while, Ajani asked again, "You said that Lucien colluded with outsiders to murder Cardinal John. Who is this outsider? And why did he murder Cardinal John?" "It's the former Duke of St. Hilda." "Who?" Ajani thought Colin was joking. But Colin said seriously, "That's right. The Duke of St. Hilda, who was supposed to be dead, has come back to life. However, I suspect that the one who came back to life is not the Duke himself, but Mr. Shui, who used some unknown forbidden spell to take over the Duke's body and come back to life." Ajani's eyes widened as she stared blankly at Colin. She obviously felt that everything he said was too unbelievable. Seeing this, Colin added calmly, "This is just my guess. It's up to you to believe it or not. However, I'm sure you know that Prince Lacy is currently at the northern frontier, and the reason he is here is because of Mr. Shui." Ajani fell into deep thought. She knew that the Duke of St. Hilda's body was stolen. After all, she was the one who personally presided over his funeral. Moreover, she had also heard about Prince Lacy. Therefore, even though Colin's guess was somewhat shocking, Ajani felt that it was very likely to be the truth of the matter. Thinking of this, her expression became extremely serious. She said in a low voice, "If Mr. Shui has really taken over the body of a holy knight, then this matter is far more terrifying than you can imagine. I have to report this to His Holiness the Pope immediately." "That's right." In order to treat the injuries on the Duke of St. Hilda's body, Mr. Schwa will definitely continue to kidnap high-ranking priests of the church. You have to be prepared. Not only that. If Mr. Schwa really has a perfect body of a holy knight, then no one will be able to control him. Colin's expression changed. He asked, why? Ajani hesitated for a moment, then said vaguely, the mages of mages are too powerful. The power of a mage's forbidden spell is too terrifying. The only thing that can restrict them now is that their bodies can't withstand the backlash of the forbidden spell. However, if Mr. Schwa has a perfect body of a holy knight, then he may not have to worry about the backlash of the forbidden spell. Colin's heart skipped a beat. He said in shock, could it be that the body of a holy knight can withstand the backlash of the forbidden spell? At least it won't be as weak as a mortal's body. Even if there is some damage, it can be repaired. If Mr. Schwa used the sacrificial method in Fallen Eagle City to share some of the backlash, I'm afraid that he will no longer be able to be restricted. A holy mage who could cast forbidden spells without any fear. Just the thought of it was terrifying. The atmosphere became extremely heavy for a moment. Just as the two of them were deep in thought, footsteps came from the room next door. Colin and Agiani immediately looked at each other, silently exchanging their thoughts. Lucien is back. Chapter 338. Where is he? Where did you find him? Who's the one who rescued him? Lucien asked Count Schultz as soon as he entered the room. Instead of answering her husband's question, Count Schultz handed over a roll of parchment to Lucien. Lucien took over the parchment in confusion. After a quick glance, his face changed greatly. What's the meaning of this? Count Schultz slowly turned around and took a sip of the coffee on the table. He said coldly, it means what it says on the paper. I want to divorce you. Lucien clenched the divorce paper tightly in his hand. His eyes were filled with the light of brutality. Why? Count Schultz avoided Lucien's fierce gaze and said calmly, because I can't tolerate you going on like this. The glory of the Schultz family can't be tarnished because of you. Lucien sneered and said mockingly, is this my fault? Back then, it was clearly the two of us who made the decision together. Now that you want to withdraw from it, isn't it too whimsical? Count Schultz shook his head slowly, no, Lucien. It was you who forced me to make the decision. It was you who allowed Bishop John to be kidnapped and murdered. It was you who broke Viscount Angley's limbs and tried to imprison him in the basement. You should be the one to bear all these crimes. Lucien suddenly burst out laughing, as if he had just heard the funniest joke in the world. After a while, he slowly approached Count Schultz and said, you want to put all these crimes on me? Hee, do you really think I'll let you do whatever you want? Grabbing Countess Schultz's smooth chin, Lucien stared into her eyes and asked, what happened in the past few days when I was away? Tell me. Count Schultz looked at Lucien, who was on the verge of exploding, fearlessly. Her tone was still indifferent, Lucien, since we were once husband and wife, I'll let you live. Sign this divorce paper and run for your life. Run for my life? Lucien sneered again. If I just walk away like this, wouldn't I be confirming the accusation that you framed me? At that time, I'll really be the one who murdered Bishop John and imprisoned Viscount Angley. Seeing that the other party had seen through his scheme, Count Schultz's eyes flashed with a hint of panic, but he quickly calmed down. What else can you do? Kill me. That will only make you fall into the abyss of eternal damnation. Lucien slowly squeezed Count Schultz's chin harder. The killing intent in Lucien's eyes was not hidden at all, and he threatened Count Schultz. You want to destroy me? Do you think I'll just surrender? Even though you're a level 6 warrior, you're still just a commoner. Who's going to believe you even if you try to defend yourself? Count Schultz sneered, even though you're a level 6 warrior, you're still just a commoner. I'm a Count of the Empire, and Viscount Angley and the Archbishop of the Northern Frontier are my witnesses. Who do you think will be convicted of those crimes? So, the only way out for you now is to get out of Swan City and never come back to the northern frontier again. Lucien looked at the woman in front of him, who had been with him for more than 20 years, and found it hard to accept that she would betray him so easily. The look in Lucien's eyes was getting more and more dangerous, and his breathing was getting heavier and heavier. It seemed that he was going to crush Count Schultz's skull in the next second. However, facing such a real death threat, Count Schultz did not flinch at all. Instead, she stared straight at her husband, as if he was already a dead man. The two confronted each other for a long time. Finally, Lucien flinched. "Tell me, what on earth happened?" Lucien asked. Count Schultz's eyes were blurred, and he said sincerely, "I met the Lord of Light and was inspired by him. That's why I made up my mind to cut off all the sins of the past." Bullsh*T. Lucien was furious. Obviously, he did not believe this kind of Bullsh*T. You have to think clearly. I'm your biggest support. If you kick me out, you'll be at the mercy of Colin. No matter what he promised you before, how can you guarantee that he won't go back on his words? Think about the Oman family and the Dawson family. Yes, although these two families seem to have not been punished, and their titles and territories are still there, what about the previous Earl Oman and Marquis Dawson? Don't you know what happened to them? Don't be fooled by that brat Colin. He's not a kind and benevolent savior, but a vicious and merciless ambitious schemer. However, his words did not wake Countess Schultz up. She continued to stare at her husband with cold eyes and said indifferently, "You're right. Sign the divorce papers, and I'll let you go. You can also take Soren with you." Hearing his son's name, Lucien could not suppress the anger in his heart again. He said fiercely, "Where's Colin? Does he not dare to come out to see me? Who says I don't dare to see you?" As soon as Lucien finished his words, he saw Colin in a wheelchair being pushed into the room by Archbishop Ajani. Lucien's eyes instantly turned bloodshot when he saw his enemy. Facing this ferocious tiger that seemed to want to devour him, Colin didn't seem to feel threatened at all. He even added fuel to the fire by saying, "Mr. Lucien, I advise you to surrender. Don't make any unnecessary resistance." Lucien let go of Count Schultz and turned to Colin with a bloodthirsty smile. "You really think I don't dare to kill you? Then what are you waiting for?" Colin still had a fearless look on his face. "I already warned you in the basement that you'd better kill me. Otherwise, I'll make you suffer a fate worse than death." Hearing Colin's words, Archbishop Ajani frowned, as if she was afraid that Lucien would really lose his mind. "Mr. Lucien, violence can't solve anything. If you kill Viscount Angley, you'll only make yourself the public enemy of the northern frontier and the nobles. Even if you successfully escape with your strength, you'll only be able to survive in a dark corner. Your best choice now is to give up resistance and admit your sins. Our Lord is merciful. He's willing to give everyone who sincerely confesses a chance to redeem themselves." Lucien's lips curled into a mocking smile. Just as he was about to speak again, his expression suddenly changed. Because he heard hurried footsteps outside the door. Obviously, a large number of Schultz family guards had gathered here. Seeing this, Colin said again, "Give up resistance, Lucien. You're just a grade 6 warrior. Do you really think you own Swan City just because you married an earl? See, you're now the enemy of this city. Aren't you proud of your superior strength? Kill everyone here if you have the ability. I only need one person to kill you." Lucien growled, his entire body turning into a bolt of lightning. In the blink of an eye, he was in front of Colin. He grabbed Colin by the collar and lifted him up from the wheelchair. He was about to mock him when he suddenly felt a sense of danger. A silver light flashed from Colin's hand, and like a venomous snake, it pierced towards Lucien's heart. Unfortunately, Lucien realized that something was wrong at the last moment. He twisted his body forcefully, avoiding his vital organs. *Chi. The dagger sank into his heart. But it did not pierce his heart. Lucien looked at Colin in shock. He had never imagined that Colin, whose limbs he had crushed 3 days ago, could recover in such a short time. Even the healing arts of the northern frontier's archbishop could not have such an effect. "You've been tricked, haven't you?" Colin smiled smugly. Lucien's eyes flashed fiercely. With a roar, he punched out with his right hand. Bang! Colin flew out like a rag doll, blood spurting out of his mouth uncontrollably. At this time, the guards also rushed in, their swords pointed at the former owner of the castle. Lucien did not have time to check whether Colin was dead or not. He immediately ran to the window and jumped out. "Quick! Don't let him get away!" Count Schultz ordered loudly. "He can't get away." Colin stood up shakily. His chest was obviously dented, but such a terrible injury did not seem to have any effect on him. Wiping the blood from the corner of his mouth, Colin also jumped out of the window. The guards also rushed out of the room. Akane didn't chase after him. Instead, she looked at Count Schultz with an inquisitive gaze. After a while, she smiled. And said, "Your Excellency, your performance today really amazed me." Count Schultz smiled faintly and said, "What? Archbishop, do you think I don't have the courage to face Lucien?" "No, I just think that not all women are like you, who can decisively cut off the relationship with her husband for the sake of justice." "Under the guidance of my lord, I have nothing to fear." Akane looked at Count Schultz's pious face and could not help but wonder what kind of promise Colin had made to Countess Schultz that made her betray Lucien. Even in the face of death, the Countess still dared to cut off the relationship with Lucien. What kind of secret was hidden in this? You're tuning in to the Blissful Bookshelf YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.